What would you do if you were bullied every day and no one was there to help? Timmy stood alone by the swings, his small body huddled as he watched the other kids laughing and playing. He wanted to join them, but the fear that gnawed at him kept him rooted to the spot. He could hear the taunts in the distance, feel the sting of their words before they even reached him. "Loser," came the shout. It was Max, the biggest kid in the class. Timmy flinched, his heart sinking as Max and his friends circled around him. "Ah, what's wrong, Timmy? Scared of a little game of tag?" Max's voice was thick with mockery, and the other boys snickered behind him. They were bigger, louder, and every day, it felt like they got stronger, while Timmy just got smaller. Timmy opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words never came. His throat tightened, and the only thing that came out was a weak squeak. He looked down at the ground, his face burning with embarrassment. Max stepped closer, his shadow looming over Timmy. "That's right, you're just a little baby," he sneered. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" Timmy's eyes welled with tears, but he didn't dare let them fall. He couldn't show them that he was weak. He couldn't give them that satisfaction, but it was all too much. He was too small, too scared, and too alone. Just when Timmy thought the teasing would never stop, a loud roar of motorcycle engines filled the air. Timmy barely had time to react before a group of bikers, tattoos on their arms, leather jackets, and helmets, pulled up to the school gates. They were loud, bold, and unapologetically different from everyone Timmy had ever seen. The leader of the group, a tall man with a rugged face and a friendly smile, noticed the commotion. He slowed his bike, taking in the scene before him. "Hey!" the man called out to Max, his voice deep and commanding. "What's going on here?" Max looked up, taken aback by the biker's presence. He sneered but didn't respond right away. Timmy's heart raced. Was he going to get into trouble? Would the bikers be angry with him for causing trouble? The man on the bike looked down at Timmy, his eyes softening when he saw the boy's bruised face. "Is he bothering you, kid?" the biker asked, his tone no longer threatening but full of genuine concern. Timmy blinked, surprised by the kindness in his voice. He didn't know how to answer, didn't know if he even could. Instead, he just nodded slowly, too scared to speak. The bikers gathered around, and one of them, a woman with bright red hair and a fierce look in her eyes, stepped forward. "You're all right now, kid," she said to Timmy. "Nobody messes with our friend." Max and his friends exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this wasn't a battle they were prepared to fight. But they didn't leave just yet. Max sneered one last time and spat on the ground. "Whatever, loser," he muttered before turning on his heel and stalking off with his friends. Timmy stood frozen, still unsure of what had just happened. His mind was spinning, and the relief he felt was quickly replaced by confusion. The bikers were gone as quickly as they had arrived, but one man remained behind, Jake, the leader of the group. "You all right, kid?" Jake asked, dismounting from his bike. His voice was low, but there was warmth in it. "I'm Jake. These are my friends. Don't worry. We've got your back." Timmy wasn't sure what to say. He felt a mix of fear and gratitude, but more than anything, he felt seen. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had noticed him. Someone cared enough to stop. "You sure you're okay?" Jake asked again, his voice softening. Timmy nodded. "Thanks," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake smiled. "You're welcome. And don't forget, if they come back, we'll be around. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't matter." "All right." Timmy blinked, fighting the lump in his throat. "All right." With that, Jake and the other bikers revved their engines and drove off, the roar of their bikes fading into the distance. Timmy stood there for a long time, the playground silent once again. But this time, it wasn't the same. Something had changed. For the first time, he didn't feel so alone. Timmy couldn't stop thinking about the bikers, their voices, their kindness, and the way they made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible after all. He couldn't quite grasp it. Why would these tough, grown adults stop everything to help him, a scared little boy who didn't even have the courage to stand up to a group of bullies? At school the next day, the usual routine unfolded. The laughter of the other kids filled the air as they ran around, chasing each other. Timmy, however, stayed at the far end of the playground, near the fence where the swings creaked in the breeze. He didn't want to get too close to anyone in case Max or his friends decided to start up again. Timmy's mind raced, replaying the encounter with Jake and the bikers. They'd told him not to worry, that they'd have his back. But how could they, strangers, really help him? It seemed too good to be true. Maybe it was just a one-time thing, a random act of kindness. Maybe they wouldn't even remember him tomorrow. "Hey, Timmy," a voice called out from behind him. Timmy froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned around to see his friend, Ben, waving to him. Ben was one of the only kids who didn't tease Timmy, but even he didn't seem to understand what it felt like to be constantly bullied. "Ben," Timmy said quietly, his voice small. He was tired of explaining how it felt. No one seemed to really get it. "Are you okay?" Ben asked, concern creasing his brow. "You've been acting kind of weird lately. You didn't come out for recess yesterday." Timmy nodded, but didn't say anything. He didn't know how to explain it. The overwhelming shame, the loneliness, the fear that the bullying would never stop. The thought of talking about it out loud made his stomach twist into knots. I'm fine," Timmy mumbled, not wanting to burden Ben with his problems. Ben had enough on his plate. He didn't need to take on Timmy's too. Ben seemed to buy it for a moment, but then his eyes narrowed. "You sure? You've been kind of quiet. And I saw you yesterday, standing by the swings. That's not like you." Timmy wanted to say something, anything, to make Ben understand. But words failed him. So instead, he just shrugged. "I'm okay, really." Ben looked like he wanted to push the issue further, but he hesitated. "Okay, if you say so." He didn't leave immediately, though. Instead, he stood there for a while, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. Timmy turned his gaze back toward the playground, watching the other kids chase after each other. But as much as he tried to pretend like he wasn't bothered, the reality was clear. He didn't fit in. He never had. The bell rang, signaling the end of recess, and Timmy trudged back to class, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened with the bikers. They had made him feel noticed, like he wasn't just a kid in the background. But as soon as they had left, the feeling had faded. He was back to being invisible, back to being the boy no one cared about. That night, when Timmy got home, his mom was already busy in the kitchen, making dinner. She was always busy. She worked 2 jobs, and even when she was home, it was like her mind was somewhere else. Timmy didn't blame her, but sometimes he wished she would see him, really see him. "Hey, Mom," Timmy said as he walked into the kitchen, trying to sound casual. "Hi, sweetie," she replied, not looking up from the stove. "How was school today?" "Okay," Timmy said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Same as always. Is everything okay? You've been acting kind of quiet lately." His mom finally turned around, a concerned look on her face. Timmy didn't want to tell her the truth. How could he explain to her that he was being bullied, that he felt like he was drowning in a sea of loneliness, when she already had so much to deal with? "I'm fine, Mom," Timmy said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "Really?" His mom nodded, but still seemed unsure. She set the wooden spoon down and walked over to him, kneeling to look him in the eyes. "You know you can tell me anything, right? No matter what." Timmy smiled weakly but didn't answer. He wanted to believe her, but part of him still felt like his problems weren't big enough to matter, like no one would truly understand. Before she could say anything else, Timmy changed the subject. "I saw some bikers today. They were really nice." His mom raised an eyebrow. "Bikers?" "Yeah. They stopped and helped me when I was having trouble at school," Timmy said, his voice a little more confident now. For some reason, talking about the bikers made him feel better. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so invisible after all. Timmy's mom looked thoughtful. "Bikers, huh?" she said, giving him a half-smile. "Well, I'm glad they helped. Just make sure they're good people, okay?" "They are," Timmy replied quickly, his heart warming at the thought of Jake and the others. They had been kind to him. They had seen him, really seen him. As his mom went back to dinner, Timmy felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The next few days at school felt like a constant tug-of-war for Timmy. Every time he saw Max and his group, his heart skipped a beat, but the memory of the bikers kept him grounded. They've got my back, he reminded himself. I'm not alone anymore. But as much as he wanted to believe that, the reality was different. Max didn't forget easily, and neither did his friends. Timmy walked into school on a Wednesday morning, his backpack slung over one shoulder, trying to keep his head down. He knew the routine by now. Sit in class, keep quiet, do his work, and then go out to the playground where the bullies waited. It was always the same. Always. But this time, something felt off. As he made his way toward the back of the schoolyard, he noticed Max and his friends standing together near the swings. They weren't laughing or shouting. Instead, they were waiting, watching, and Timmy could feel their eyes on him before he even got close. He took a deep breath, his heart racing. Just get through the day, Timmy, he told himself. Just get through it. But as soon as Max saw him, the smirk returned. Well, if it isn't little Timmy, Max called, loud enough for everyone around to hear. Timmy froze, his stomach dropping. Not again, he thought. Max stepped forward, his friends following behind like a pack of wolves. You think those bikers are going to save you, he sneered. They're probably long gone, huh? They're not here now, are they? Timmy's hands started to tremble, but he refused to back down. He remembered what Jake had told him. If they come back, we'll be around. But the truth was, Jake wasn't here. And neither were the bikers. Max stepped even closer, towering over Timmy. Look at you, standing there like a little mouse. Pathetic. Timmy's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, to escape to the safety of the school building, but his legs wouldn't move. He felt like he was trapped in a cage of fear. Leave me alone, Max, Timmy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He hated how weak it sounded. Max grinned, his eyes lighting up with cruel satisfaction. What's that? You want me to leave you alone? You think you can tell me what to do? You're just a freak. Timmy's chest tightened. The words stung, but they weren't the worst part. The worst part was how Max's friends joined in, laughing and egging him on. They were all so big, so confident, and Timmy felt so small, so invisible. Then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, a familiar sound broke through the air, the roar of motorcycle engines. Timmy's heart jumped in his chest. His eyes widened as the same group of bikers from the other day pulled into the school parking lot, their engines growling like a pack of wild animals. Max and his friends turned around in surprise, their faces filled with uncertainty. They didn't know what to make of the bikers. They had seen them before, but this time it felt different. The bikers were here for Timmy. Jake, the leader of the group, spotted Timmy almost immediately. He slowed down his bike, giving Max a long, hard stare before dismounting and walking toward Timmy. Well, Jake said with a grin. Looks like we've got ourselves a situation. Max's sneer faltered as he took in Jake's imposing figure and the rest of the bikers, all of them towering over him like a wall. There was a brief, tense moment where no one spoke. Timmy's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the heat rising to his face, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. You again? Max scoffed, trying to keep up his bravado. You really think you can intimidate me with these clowns? Jake's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but full of authority. I'm not here to intimidate anyone, kid. I'm here because you've been bothering someone who's under my protection, and I'm not going to stand by and let that continue. Max took a step back, clearly not expecting this. The other kids who had been following him now hesitated, unsure of how to act. You're messing with the wrong person, Jake said, his voice low and serious. If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away. For a moment, it looked like Max was going to argue, but then, with a grunt of frustration, he turned and stormed off, his friends reluctantly following behind him. Timmy stood there, stunned. The tension in the air began to dissipate, and the bikers, like a sudden storm passing through, were just as quickly gone as they had arrived. Jake turned to Timmy, a reassuring smile on his face. You all right, kid? Timmy could barely find his words. He felt a lump in his throat, and his eyes welled with tears. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice shaky. I don't know what to say. Jake clapped him on the back, the gesture surprisingly gentle for someone who looked so tough. "No need to thank me. We've got your back, Timmy. Just remember, you're never alone." Timmy nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe things really were changing. Maybe he wasn't invisible after all. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Timmy's mind was still reeling from the encounter with Max and the bikers. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel like a target. He wasn't sure if it was the bikers' presence or the fact that they had actually stood up to Max, but something inside him felt different, stronger, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. When the final bell rang, Timmy gathered his things slowly, the usual dread of facing the outside world gone. Instead, there was a quiet sense of anticipation, like something had shifted, and he wasn't so alone anymore. As he walked out of the school building, he spotted the bikers across the parking lot, their motorcycles lined up in a row, the chrome shining in the late afternoon sun. Jake was talking to one of the other bikers, laughing about something that Timmy couldn't quite hear. The scene felt surreal. A group of tough, leather-clad adults who had just confronted his bullies, and now they were standing there like a new kind of family. Timmy hesitated at the edge of the parking lot, unsure of what to do. Should he just walk away? Was this all just a temporary thing, a one-time act of kindness? He took a deep breath and walked over to them, his heart thumping in his chest. As he approached, Jake saw him and waved him over. "Hey, Timmy," Jake called out, his voice friendly and warm. "You heading home?" Timmy nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and relief. "Yeah, I guess. I didn't think you'd still be here." Jake chuckled and gestured toward his bike. "Well, we're kind of hard to miss. You mind if we hang out for a bit?" Timmy looked at the others, big, burly men with tattoos and leather jackets. They didn't look like the kind of people you'd expect to see hanging out with a shy, sixth-grade kid. But somehow, it felt natural, like he was meant to be here with them. "Sure," Timmy said, a little unsure of himself. But Jake's grin was contagious, and before he knew it, Timmy was sitting on the curb next to the bikes, talking with the group. "So, what's your story, Timmy?" One of the bikers, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, asked. His name was Mark, Timmy learned. Timmy shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to explain the loneliness that weighed on him every day. But there was something about these guys, their easygoing attitude, their kindness, that made him want to open up. "I guess. I don't have many friends at school," Timmy admitted, looking down at his shoes. "And there's this kid, Max, who always picks on me." Jake nodded knowingly. "Bullies, huh? Yeah, we've all been there. It's never fun." Mark smiled sympathetically. "Yeah, we all know what it's like to be the underdog. But you're not alone anymore, Timmy. We've got your back, man." Timmy's chest tightened at their words. He hadn't expected this. People who really cared. They weren't just talking about protecting him from the bullies. They were offering something bigger. A sense of belonging. "You don't have to be scared anymore, okay?" Jake said, looking Timmy in the eye. "You've got us. And if Max or anyone else gives you trouble, you know where to find us." Timmy smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thanks. I don't know what I would have done without you guys." "You don't have to do anything alone," Mark added, giving him a thumbs up. "We're like a family, kid." Timmy's heart swelled at that. He had never had a real family, not like this. His mom worked long hours, and his dad wasn't around. It was always just him. But now, here were these people who were offering him something more than just protection. They were offering friendship. As the sun started to set, the bikers gathered their things, preparing to leave. Jake patted Timmy on the back before getting on his bike. "We'll be here tomorrow, buddy," Jake said, his voice reassuring. "Same time, same place. If you want to hang out, just let us know." Timmy felt a rush of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't going home dreading the next day. He had a group of people who cared about him, and that made all the difference. The next morning, Timmy woke up with a strange sense of excitement. The fear he usually felt as he got ready for school had been replaced by something new. It was the promise of something better. The thought that, maybe, things weren't as bad as they seemed. At school, things didn't magically get easier, of course. Max was still around, still sneering, still taunting. But today, When Max and his friends tried to corner Timmy by the swings, Timmy didn't back down. He stood his ground, remembering what Jake had said, "We've got your back." And sure enough, when the bullies took another step forward, Timmy heard the roar of motorcycles in the distance. The familiar sound was like a shot of adrenaline straight to his veins. Jake and the others pulled up just in time, their bikes revving to a halt in front of Max and his group. The bikers didn't need to say anything this time. The message was clear: you don't mess with Timmy. Max and his friends glanced at each other, then looked back at the bikers, suddenly unsure. They weren't so brave now. Max hesitated before sneering and muttering something under his breath. "This isn't over, Timmy." Timmy didn't respond. Instead, he stood tall, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. He wasn't afraid anymore. With the bikers by his side, he felt stronger, braver. And as Max and his friends retreated, Timmy realized something important. He wasn't invisible anymore. He didn't have to be. Not with people like Jake and the others in his corner. Timmy's life had already started to feel different. The bikers had become his unexpected support system, and though he still struggled with the day-to-day challenges at school, the weight of his loneliness seemed a little lighter. Every time he thought of the bikers, a sense of warmth filled him, as though they had given him a piece of the family he never had. But no one could escape the daily grind forever. The following week, the tensions with Max escalated. The taunts and sneers were more frequent now, as if Max and his friends had taken Timmy's growing confidence as a challenge. But this time, there was something different about the way Max approached him. It wasn't just mocking or teasing anymore. It felt personal. Max was testing him. Timmy felt it in the pit of his stomach, that familiar knot of dread. He tried to shake it off, but the doubt lingered. Could he really stand up to Max on his own? What would happen if the bikers weren't around next time? It was a Friday afternoon, just after lunch, when Max made his move. Timmy had been walking alone across the schoolyard, trying to make his way to the library. His head was buried in a book, trying to escape the noise of the schoolyard and the whispers that followed him wherever he went. "You think you're tough now, huh, Timmy?" Max's voice came from behind him, dripping with venom. Timmy's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard Max approach, but there he was, standing in his path with that familiar smirk plastered on his face. "Why don't you show us what you've learned?" Max taunted. "Or maybe you'll just go running to your biker buddies again, huh?" Timmy straightened his back. He wanted to look Max in the eye, to show him that he wasn't afraid, but his legs felt weak. The words of Jake and the others echoed in his mind. "You've got this. You're not alone anymore." But it wasn't enough to just stand there and hope for someone to save him. He had to show Max that he was different now, that he was stronger than he had been before. "I'm not scared of you, Max," Timmy said, his voice trembling but determined. Max laughed, a low, cruel sound that sent shivers down Timmy's spine. "Not scared? You should be." He stepped closer, and Timmy instinctively took a step back. Max was right in his face now, too close. Timmy's hands balled into fists, his palms sweating. "This is it, Timmy," he thought. No turning back now. Just as Max raised his hand, ready to shove him, Timmy heard the unmistakable roar of motorcycles in the distance. His heart lifted as he turned his head, hoping that his new friends were close. And there they were. The bikers, riding in like a storm, pulling into the school parking lot with their engines roaring louder than ever. Timmy couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. But there was something else, too. Something deeper than just the reassurance that they would protect him. Timmy realized he had to face this on his own. The bikers had taught him that, but it was up to him to take the next step. And he wasn't going to let Max push him around anymore. Max noticed the bikers too, his expression faltering for just a second before the arrogance returned. "What? You think these guys are going to save you again?" he sneered. Jake slowed his bike, his eyes locking on Max with a steely gaze. "You're not getting it, are you, kid?" he called out. "This isn't about saving anyone. It's about respecting people. Something you clearly know nothing about." Max opened his mouth, but Timmy cut him off, stepping forward, his voice clear and strong. "No, Max. This isn't about you. I don't need anyone to save me. I can stand up for myself. But if you want to keep testing me, we can see how it goes." Max's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. Timmy could see the anger in his eyes, but he didn't flinch. The bikers weren't here to fight. They weren't here to intervene. They were here to let Timmy take control. Max hesitated, his pride warring with the reality in front of him. He looked at Timmy, then back at the bikers, and finally muttered under his breath, "You're not worth my time." With a final sneer, Max turned on his heel and walked away, his friends trailing behind him. The schoolyard felt suddenly quieter, the weight of the moment still heavy in the air. Timmy stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had stood up for himself, not because of the bikers, but because he had learned from them. He felt a sense of pride he'd never known before. Jake and the others dismounted, walking over to Timmy with smiles on their faces. "Nice job, kid," Jake said, clapping him on the back. "That's the way to do it." "You didn't need us today," Mark added, his voice full of pride. "You handled that like a pro." Timmy smiled, his chest swelling with confidence. "I guess I learned from the best." And for the first time, Timmy felt like he had truly turned a corner. The bullies were still there, lurking in the background, but now, he wasn't scared anymore. He didn't need someone else to fight his battles for him. He had learned that standing up for himself was the first step toward owning his own strength. The bikers were still there, of course, their presence a comforting reminder that he wasn't truly alone. But now, he knew that the real strength came from within. And that was something Max could never take away from him. Timmy's newfound confidence didn't go unnoticed. Word spread quickly around school, and by the end of the week, whispers followed him in the hallways. It wasn't just the other kids. Some of the teachers seemed to watch him a little closer too, as though they had sensed a shift in him, a change that wasn't entirely understood, but was definitely felt. For the first time in a long while, Timmy walked through the school with his head held high, his backpack slung over his shoulder with a sense of purpose. He wasn't the quiet, shy kid anymore. He was someone who had faced his biggest bully and won, someone who had stood up for himself and learned to trust in his own strength. But no victory comes without a price. Max wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. That afternoon, as Timmy made his way home, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Max was walking alongside his usual group of friends, but this time, there was an edge to his movements, like he was planning something. The group of boys had been quiet, too quiet, as if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Timmy's stomach twisted. He could feel the old anxiety creeping back in, but he pushed it down. "You're not that scared kid anymore," he reminded himself. "You've got this." As he reached the corner of his street, however, Max and his friends turned sharply, blocking his path. Timmy's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him to turn and run, but he knew that would only make things worse. He had already stood up to Max once. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions now. But as Max stepped closer, his face twisted in a sneer, Timmy felt something stir deep inside him. Doubt. The bikers hadn't been around. There was no roaring sound of motorcycles, no backup coming to rescue him. What if I can't handle this on my own? The thought lingered like a shadow, chilling him. "Looks like you've got a little too much courage for your own good, Timmy," Max taunted, circling him with his friends. "Let's see how brave you are when you're alone." Timmy's pulse raced. They were closing in, and he was outnumbered. His fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment, he felt that old fear creeping back, the fear that he wasn't strong enough. "What if I lose this time?" Max took another step toward him. "You think you're tough now, don't you? I'm gonna make sure you never forget your place." Timmy's legs felt shaky, his mind running 1,000 miles a minute. Where are the bikers? He thought desperately. "I can't do this alone." Suddenly, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of roaring engines. His heart lifted, and without thinking, Timmy straightened up. "No, I don't need them to fight this battle. Not this time." Max's grin faltered as he turned to see the bikes pulling up, the engines growling like a beast on the prowl. The bikers, led by Jake, came to a halt in front of Max and his group. Timmy could feel the tension in the air, a strange mixture of dread and hope. "Is there a problem here?" Jake's voice rang out, calm but firm. Max hesitated, his bravado faltering as he saw the bikers step off their bikes, their postures imposing. He shot a glance at Timmy, who stood taller now, his fist still clenched, but with something different in his eyes. Something Max couldn't read. Timmy took a step forward, his voice steady as he spoke. "No, Jake. I've got this." Jake looked at Timmy for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. Then he nodded, stepping back, along with the other bikers, to give Timmy space. Max sneered, but there was something in Timmy's stance now, something that told him this wouldn't be easy. "What? You think you can take me on?" Max spat. "You're just a little kid, Timmy." "I'm not a kid anymore," Timmy said quietly, his voice gaining strength with each word. "And I'm not afraid of you." Max's face twisted in anger. "You'll regret this, Timmy." For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air, like the calm before a storm. Timmy stood his ground, his mind racing. But this time he didn't feel the crushing weight of fear. He was scared, yes, but he didn't let that stop him. Max and his group exchanged glances, but the bikers' presence made them hesitate. After a long, tense silence, Max's face darkened. "This isn't over," Max snarled, before he turned and walked away, his friends reluctantly following behind. As Timmy watched them go, he realized something important. It wasn't the biker's presence that had made him stand tall. It was the fact that, for the first time, he had believed in himself. Even without their backup, even in the face of Max's threat, he hadn't let doubt consume him. Jake stepped forward once Max and his group were out of sight. "You did good, Timmy," he said with a smile. "We knew you could do it." Timmy felt a rush of pride flood through him, but there was also a wave of exhaustion that followed. He had faced his fear, and won. "I almost didn't," Timmy admitted, his voice quieter now. "I wasn't sure if I could do it on my own." "You don't always have to do it alone," Jake said, his tone understanding. "But you proved today that you don't need anyone to fight your battles. You've got what it takes." Timmy nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of gratitude. "Thanks, Jake. Thanks for believing in me." Jake slapped him on the back, and Timmy couldn't help but grin. The bikers were more than just protectors. They were mentors, showing him not only how to stand up to bullies, but also how to believe in his own strength. As Timmy made his way home, the weight of the day's events didn't feel as heavy. He had faced Max again and won. But more importantly, he had faced his own doubt and come out stronger for it. He wasn't the same boy who had walked into school weeks ago. He was someone new, someone capable, someone who no longer feared the world around him. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. The days that followed Timmy's confrontation with Max felt almost surreal. It was as though a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The hallway whispers, the rumors, the subtle taunts, everything seemed less important. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the target of other people's ridicule. But as the feeling of victory settled in, so did an unexpected sense of unease. Timmy had faced Max, but he hadn't faced everything. There was still the nagging feeling that the past, his lonely, isolated life before the bikers, was never too far behind. It was the kind of quiet darkness that lingered in the back of his mind, creeping in whenever he was alone. That evening, as he sat in his room, Timmy found himself staring out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance, but tonight, it felt different. There was a heaviness to the air, as if something was coming. Something he couldn't quite put into words. The knock on the door startled him. "Timmy, are you in there?" His mother's voice floated through the door. Timmy stood up and opened it. His mother stood there, her face strained, her eyes tired. "Hey, kiddo," she said softly, stepping into his room. "I know you've been through a lot lately, and I just want to make sure you're okay." Timmy nodded, forcing a smile, but something in his mother's eyes made his stomach twist. It wasn't just concern, it was fear. "I'm fine, Mom," Timmy said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I've been doing great at school, no more bullies." His mother smiled faintly but didn't look convinced. She sat down on the edge of his bed, her eyes scanning the room as if she were searching for something, or perhaps just trying to find a sign that everything was as it seemed. "You're so strong, Timmy," she said quietly, "but I can't help but worry sometimes. You're not just fighting the kids at school anymore, are you?" Timmy blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" His mother sighed, rubbing her temples. It's hard to explain. I know you've got those bikers, and I know they've helped you, but I want you to be careful. I don't want you to get caught up in something you don't understand. Timmy's chest tightened. He had never really talked to his mom about the bikers, not in detail. She knew they were around, but she didn't know how much they had become a part of his life. She didn't know what they meant to him. They're good people, Mom, Timmy said, trying to reassure her. They've helped me more than anyone ever has. His mother's eyes softened, but her worry didn't go away. I know they're good to you, Timmy, but there's a part of this world you don't know yet. They live a rough life, and sometimes it's hard to separate the good from the bad. Timmy frowned, sitting down next to her. I'm not getting involved in anything bad, Mom. They're there for me. I can talk to them. They've helped me face my fears. She smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. I'm glad you have someone to talk to, but don't let their world become your world. You don't want to find yourself in a place you can't get out of. Timmy wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't understand. But deep down, he could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the fear that maybe the biker's world wasn't as simple as he thought. He didn't know what that world was like. He only knew that it had been the only place where he had felt seen. It had been the only thing that had pulled him out of the darkness of loneliness. The conversation hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. Finally, his mother stood, her hand resting on his shoulder. I just want what's best for you, Timmy. Please promise me you'll be careful. I promise, Mom, Timmy said, even though he wasn't sure what he was promising. He didn't want to disappoint her. But the truth was, he didn't want to lose the only support system he had either. As she left the room, Timmy stood there, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. He understood his mom's concern. She wanted to protect him from everything that had hurt her, the uncertainty that had followed her through life. But for the first time in a long time, Timmy had a sense of who he was. And he didn't want to lose that, not for anything. Still, his mother's words lingered, and a question that he hadn't considered before started to creep into his mind. What if she's right? What if I'm in over my head? The next day, as Timmy was walking to school, he saw them again, the bikers. They were gathered in the usual spot, near the park, their bikes lined up like soldiers at attention. The sight of them made Timmy's chest swell with warmth, but today, he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't as simple as they seemed. He walked over, and Jake waved him over with a grin. Hey, kid, you ready to take on another day? He asked, his voice always full of energy. Timmy smiled, but the weight of the conversation with his mother still lingered. Yeah, just thinking about some stuff. Jake's smile softened, noticing the shift in Timmy's demeanor. What's on your mind? Timmy hesitated, looking at the ground for a moment. My mom's worried. She doesn't know much about you guys, but she doesn't want me to get caught up in your world. She says it's not as easy as it seems. Jake's expression grew more serious. He looked around, as if considering how much to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but calm. Your mom's just trying to protect you, Timmy. She doesn't know what we've been through, and she doesn't know what we're doing for you. But I get where she's coming from. We're not all sunshine and rainbows. Life can get messy. Timmy looked up at him, his heart heavy. I don't want to lose you guys. You're the only people who've ever made me feel like I matter. Jake nodded, his eyes reflecting a sadness Timmy hadn't expected. And you matter to us, Timmy. But you have to remember, you can stand on your own. We're here for you, but you can't let us be the thing that defines you. Timmy's throat tightened. He understood what Jake was trying to say, but it felt harder than ever to hear. He didn't want to lose the only place where he truly felt like he belonged. You'll figure it out, Timmy, Jake said, giving him a reassuring pat on the back. Just don't let anyone tell you who you are. Not even us. Timmy nodded slowly, the weight of his mother's concern and Jake's words settling on his shoulders. There were things in life that weren't easy to face, and for the first time, Timmy realized he had to choose not just who he was, but who he wanted to become. The following week, the weight of the choices Timmy was facing grew heavier. He woke up to his mother's concerned gaze every morning, and the echo of her words, "Be careful," followed him through every step of the day. Despite his resolve to stand on his own, a sense of unease remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, a storm he couldn't quite predict. School was quieter now. Max had backed off, but there was still tension hanging in the air. Timmy found himself glancing over his shoulder more often, expecting a confrontation that never came. The bikers were still around, but lately, there had been a subtle shift. They weren't as present in his life as they had been. Jake and the others seemed to be pulling back, offering him space. Maybe they thought he was ready to handle things on his own. Maybe they thought it was time for him to find his own way. But that's what scared Timmy the most. He didn't know if he was ready. That afternoon, after school, Timmy was walking home when he spotted one of the bikers, Vince, standing by his bike near the corner. Vince was always a bit more reserved, the quieter one of the group, but Timmy had always felt a sense of camaraderie with him. Vince had a way of listening, of making you feel like your problems weren't as small as they seemed. "Hey, Timmy," Vince greeted with a nod, noticing him approach. "Got a minute?" Timmy stopped, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. "Yeah, what's up?" Vince glanced around, as if checking for anyone nearby, before motioning for Timmy to come closer. "There's something I need to talk to you about. It's important, all right?" Timmy's heart skipped a beat. What's going on? Vince's eyes were serious now, more intense than Timmy had ever seen. "I need to know if you're with us, Timmy. I know you've got a lot going on. Your mom, school, everything. But the thing is, we don't just help people for no reason. There's a loyalty to this group, and it's not always easy. You've got to choose your side." Timmy swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He hadn't expected this conversation. Not like this, not so soon. He had always thought of the bikers as a source of safety, of friendship, but Vince's words hit differently. This wasn't just about protection. It was about loyalty, commitment, and perhaps something deeper than he was ready to understand. "What do you mean, choose my side?" Timmy asked, his voice shaky. Vince looked at him intently, his gaze piercing. "There are people who would love to see you fail, Timmy. People who think you're weak, that you're just a kid. But we're not just a group of people who ride bikes, man. We're a family. And being part of that family means standing with us, through everything." Timmy nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had always known the bikers had their own code, their own way of living, but he never realized how serious it was. The thought of choosing them, of being part of something bigger than just himself, felt like an impossible decision. He didn't want to disappoint anyone, but was he truly ready to make this kind of commitment? "I'm not sure what you mean," Timmy said, his voice almost a whisper. "What does that mean for me? For my life?" Vince took a deep breath, looking at Timmy as though he could read every question in his head. "It means you have to decide what you want, kid. You've been through a lot, I get it. And I'm not saying you have to jump in head first. But I'm telling you, if you want to keep standing with us, you've got to make a choice. It's not about just showing up when you need something. It's about being there when it counts." Timmy felt the weight of Vince's words settle in his chest. He hadn't expected the conversation to be this heavy, to feel like a crossroads, a decision that would define everything that came after. But there was a part of him that was terrified of the commitment. What would it mean for his relationship with his mother? What would it mean for his future? Could he balance the life of a young kid, trying to find his place in the world, and the loyalty of a family bound by something as deep as the biker's code? "I need some time to think about it," Timmy finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. Vince nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. But just know that when the time comes, you'll have to make a decision. I'm not saying this to pressure you, Timmy, but the longer you wait, the harder it gets." Timmy stood there for a moment, watching as Vince mounted his bike, revving the engine with a low growl before taking off down the street, leaving Timmy alone with his thoughts. He walked the rest of the way home in a daze, his mind spinning. His mother's warning about the bikers echoed in his mind, but Vince's words, too, were like a siren call. It felt as though everything was changing at once, like his life was being pulled in two opposite directions. That night, as Timmy sat alone in his room, he thought about what Vince had said. The bikers weren't just a source of protection or a place to belong. They were offering him something more. They were offering him a family, a sense of purpose. But at what cost? Could he really commit to something that wasn't just about standing up to Max, something that might change his life forever? It was a choice that weighed heavily on him, one that would define what kind of person he would become. And as he lay in bed that night, he realized that no matter what decision he made, there was no going back. Life would never be the same again. Timmy woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling that wouldn't leave. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his shoes, still not sure what to do. The weight of Vince's words pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. When the time comes, you'll have to make a decision. What decision? And how would he know when that time actually arrived? He had always been a kid who ran away from problems, kept his head down, and tried to avoid confrontation. But the bikers were asking him for something deeper, something more permanent. Could he give that to them without losing himself in the process? The phone buzzed on his nightstand, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from Jake. "Jake, we need you. Meet us by the old warehouse at 4 p.m. today. It's time." Timmy's heart raced. He knew what this meant. It was the test Vince had warned him about. They were going to see if he had the loyalty to stand with them when it mattered. He didn't need to think about it any longer. His answer was clear. He had to go. When Timmy arrived at the old warehouse that afternoon, he found the usual group of bikers gathered by their bikes. The place was deserted, the air thick with the smell of oil and gasoline. It was a quiet, almost eerie setting, as if the world had temporarily stopped just for them. Jake spotted him first. "Timmy," he said with a nod, motioning for him to approach. The other bikers, including Vince, were standing a little further off, their faces unreadable, watching him carefully. "Glad you made it," Jake said, walking up to Timmy. "This is the moment, kid. We've got a job to do, and we need someone who's got the heart for it. You think you're ready?" Timmy swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "I don't know, Jake. Look, Timmy." Jake cut him off, his voice firm. "This isn't about what you know. It's about who you are. If you're here, it means you've made your choice. You want in. You want to be part of the family? This is it. We've got to take care of a little situation, and we need your help." Timmy's stomach twisted. He had always been told that actions spoke louder than words, but this felt different. He had to prove himself, not just to Jake and Vince, but to himself. He needed to know if he could do it, if he could really become part of this world without losing who he was. "What do I need to do?" Timmy asked, his voice shaky but determined. Jake looked at him closely, eyes narrowing. "We've got a guy who's been causing trouble, trying to mess with the family. He's crossed some lines. Now, we need to send a message." Timmy felt a chill run down his spine. "A message? What kind of message?" Vince stepped forward, his voice calm but serious. "It's not a big deal. We're not looking to start a war. We just need to remind people not to mess with us." Timmy wasn't sure what to think. The bikers had always been a source of comfort and protection for him, but now, the reality of their world was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about standing up to bullies at school or riding bikes. It was about a world that was more dangerous and unpredictable than he had imagined. "Are you sure I'm ready for this?" Timmy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled, a cold, almost calculating smile. "You've got it in you. But there's no turning back after today. Once you take this step, you're one of us for good. You're in." Timmy felt his heartbeat quicken. His mind raced, and for a moment, he considered turning and walking away, disappearing back into his old life. But the thought of being nothing again, of fading into the background, was even more terrifying than whatever the bikers had planned. He nodded. "I'm in." Jake's grin widened, and he slapped Timmy on the back. "That's what I like to hear." Vince handed him a helmet, and Timmy put it on, his hands trembling. The air was thick with tension, the bikers' quiet murmurs the only sound as they prepared to leave. Timmy could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting to see if he would rise to the challenge. "Let's go," Jake said, nodding toward the road. "Stay close, and follow our lead." Timmy climbed onto his bike, his mind racing as the engines roared to life. The group took off in a blur of speed and power, the wind whipping through Timmy's hair as they sped down the empty road. The thrill of it, the rush of adrenaline, felt like freedom, but it was also laced with a sense of danger he couldn't ignore. As they approached the outskirts of town, Timmy could see the outline of a rundown building. It was a small warehouse, the kind of place that looked abandoned and forgotten. But Timmy knew better. This was where the biker's business was about to go down. Jake pulled up in front of the warehouse, stopping with a precise ease. The others followed suit, parking their bikes in a tight formation. Timmy parked beside them, his hands still shaking. He wasn't sure if it was from fear or excitement, or both. "This is it," Jake said, his voice low but full of authority. "Stay alert. We're not here to play games." Vince and the others dismounted, walking toward the door of the warehouse with the kind of confidence Timmy had never seen before. They were ready for whatever was about to happen. Timmy stayed close, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the door, and Jake kicked it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, a man stood waiting, someone Timmy didn't recognize, but he could feel the tension in the air the moment they stepped inside. "This is the guy," Jake said, motioning toward the man. "He's been stirring up trouble, crossing lines. We need to remind him who runs this town." Timmy felt a knot form in his stomach. Was this really what he had signed up for? The moment was surreal, the gravity of it sinking in. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was part of something much bigger, something darker. Jake stepped forward, his voice hard and commanding. "You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. Don't forget that." The man didn't say anything. He only nodded, a mix of fear and defiance in his eyes. The bikers surrounded him, and for a moment, Timmy just stood there, frozen. This wasn't the world he had imagined, and it wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about survival. The first test had begun. The inside of the warehouse felt cold and oppressive, the dim light casting long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Timmy's heart was still pounding in his chest, his hands clenched tightly around the handle of his bike, now parked a few feet away. The sound of the door creaking shut echoed in the silence, and for a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Jake stood tall in front of the man, his posture rigid and authoritative, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. Timmy had only just stepped into this world, and now he found himself caught in the tension of it all. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the situation. The man who was the target of the biker's ire looked older than Timmy had imagined, maybe in his mid-30s. His clothes were tattered, and his face was weathered, but it was his eyes that caught Timmy's attention. Angry, defiant, yet fearful, as if he knew what was coming and could do nothing to stop it. Jake stepped closer, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You think you can push us around? You've been causing trouble with our people, and you know the rules. Mess with us, and there's a price to pay." The man opened his mouth to speak, but Jake didn't let him. No excuses. No more warnings. Timmy watched, his body tense. He had seen the bikers as a group that protected people like him, but now he was seeing the other side of them. Their power, their intimidation. This wasn't just about standing up for what was right anymore. It was about dominance. The man, now visibly shaken, didn't argue. He just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. Vince, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward. "Jake's right. We don't let anyone walk over us. This guy needs to learn that lesson." His voice was calm, almost detached, like this was just another day at the office. Timmy felt a surge of discomfort. He wanted to speak up, to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. This was what they did. This was the world they lived in. It wasn't about right and wrong. It was about power and respect. And it felt wrong. It felt like a line had just been crossed, a line he wasn't sure he could come back from. But then Jake looked at him, his eyes locking with Timmy's for a moment. "Timmy," Jake called, his tone soft but urgent. "This is where you prove yourself. You want to be part of this family? This is the moment." Timmy's stomach twisted. His gaze flickered to the man in front of him, who was still standing silently, clearly trying to hold back the fear he was feeling. Then, slowly, Timmy turned his gaze back to Jake. The weight of it all felt suffocating. He could see the expectation in Jake's eyes, the expectation that Timmy would join in, that he would accept this world. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in on him. He had been looking for a place to belong, a family to call his own. But this wasn't the kind of family he had imagined. It wasn't about loyalty or friendship. It was about fear. and Timmy wasn't sure if he could live with that. Vince saw the hesitation in Timmy's eyes. Don't think about it too much, kid. You're part of the team now. You gotta stand with us. The man in front of them trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to survive. You don't have to do this. Timmy took a step back, his heart racing. Was it really survival that drove this man to this point? Or was it just his own desperation? And did that desperation make him any different from the bikers? Were they all just trying to survive in a world that didn't care? Timmy felt the pull of his conscience, the nagging voice in his head telling him this wasn't right. But there was another voice, louder and stronger, telling him that if he didn't stand up now, if he didn't make this choice, he would never be accepted. He would always be on the outside. Jake, noticing Timmy's indecision, narrowed his eyes. What's it gonna be, Timmy? Are you with us or not? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Timmy had to make a decision. He could feel the eyes of the bikers on him, waiting for him to prove himself. He was terrified of what would happen if he backed out now, terrified of losing the chance to finally belong. But as he looked at the man in front of him, who was clearly no threat, a sense of clarity washed over Timmy. He didn't want to become like this, to let fear and intimidation guide him. He had spent too many years running from his problems, but he couldn't run from himself. He couldn't let this be who he became. Without thinking, Timmy stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. I don't think this is right. He's just a guy trying to get by. We don't need to do this. The room went silent. Jake's expression darkened, and the other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking between Timmy and the man. For a moment, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Then, Jake broke the silence with a cold laugh. You don't get it, do you, Timmy? This is how the world works. You either stand with us, or you're just another target. Timmy's heart pounded in his chest, but his words came out steady. I don't want to be like this. I won't do it. For a long moment, Jake didn't say anything. The tension in the room was palpable, and Timmy could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice low and dangerous. You've made your choice, Timmy, but remember, there's no going back now. Vince looked at Timmy, disappointment written across his face, but there was something else in his eyes, an understanding, maybe even a trace of respect. You're on your own now, kid. Timmy stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, as the bikers turned and walked out of the warehouse. The man they had come for remained, still visibly shaken, but now spared from whatever fate had been planned for him. Timmy felt a weight lift off his chest as the bikers disappeared into the night, but the sense of loss, of not belonging, settled heavily in its place. As Timmy walked out into the cool night air, he realized that he had just made the hardest choice of his life. He had chosen to walk away from the bikers, from the family he thought he wanted, and now he had no idea what would come next. But one thing was clear. He was no longer just a kid trying to fit in. He was someone who had made a stand, and for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. The night air was cool, but it didn't do much to calm Timmy's nerves. He stood outside the warehouse, watching the taillights of the bikers fade into the distance. The silence around him was deafening, almost suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a mistake. A huge mistake. But as the seconds passed, and the glow of the bikers' motorcycles disappeared into the dark horizon, something inside Timmy shifted. He felt a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't need to fit into their world. He didn't need to prove anything to them. It was the first time in his life that he had truly stood up for what he believed in, no matter the cost. And although the decision was painful, Timmy knew he had made the right choice for himself. He could walk away from the bikers, but he couldn't walk away from the person he wanted to be. He looked back toward the door of the warehouse where the man, the one the bikers had come for, was still standing. He wasn't sure if the man would ever be the same after what had almost happened to him, but in that moment, Timmy felt a connection with him. Both of them had been trapped in this world, struggling to find a way out. The man caught Timmy's gaze and gave him a small nod of gratitude, as if acknowledging what had just transpired. There was no need for words. Timmy had made a choice, and it had mattered. Back at his apartment, Timmy sat alone, his mind still racing. He had expected some kind of relief after walking away from the bikers. Instead, he felt empty. His phone buzzed, and he instinctively reached for it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. Jake, we need to talk. Timmy swallowed hard. He knew this conversation was coming. The bikers weren't just going to let him walk away without consequences. He had made his choice, but now it was time to face the fallout. Timmy didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what he could say, or if anything he said would even matter. But after a few minutes of staring at the screen, he typed a simple reply. Timmy, I'm done. I can't be a part of that life. The message felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders, but also like a door slamming shut behind him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he had made his decision. There was no turning back now. The next morning, Timmy woke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He rubbed his eyes and grabbed it, still groggy from a restless night. A new message popped up, this time from his mom. Mom, Timmy, I just heard some worrying things. Are you okay? Please come home tonight. Timmy frowned, his stomach twisting. His mom had always been a rock for him, the one person who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He hadn't told her about the bikers, about the decisions he had been making, and now it seemed like the truth was catching up to him. He couldn't lie to her. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine anymore. His world had changed, and it wasn't something he could hide from her. With a sigh, Timmy typed a response. Timmy, I'm fine, Mom. I'll be home later tonight. Love you. Later that afternoon, Timmy found himself standing outside the small coffee shop he had always gone to. He hadn't been here in weeks. He had been too caught up in the chaos of the bikers' world, too distracted by everything going on. But now, it felt like the only place where he could breathe again. He stepped inside, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air. The sound of soft chatter and clinking mugs was oddly comforting, a reminder of the life he had once known. The barista behind the counter, a young woman with bright blue hair, smiled at him as he approached. Hey, Timmy, haven't seen you in a while. What can I get for you? She asked. Timmy returned her smile, though it felt a little strained. Just a coffee, thanks. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The world outside the coffee shop felt distant now, like it didn't belong to him anymore. The life he had been so desperate to leave behind had a way of pulling him back, even when he thought he was free. When his coffee was ready, Timmy took it, nodding at the barista before stepping out of the shop. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the weight of the decision he had made hung over him like a cloud. He had stood up for what he believed in, but at what cost? His phone buzzed again, and he checked it, hoping it wasn't another message from Jake. To his relief, it was from his mom. Mom, I'm making dinner tonight. Please come home. Timmy, we need to talk. Timmy hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The idea of facing his mom, of telling her everything that had happened, was both comforting and terrifying. She had always been his anchor, and he didn't want to disappoint her. But how could he explain the choices he had made, the things he had seen, the darkness he had encountered? He felt like a different person now. The boy who had walked into the biker world weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone more uncertain, more torn. Timmy knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. With a sigh, he typed a simple response. Timmy, I'll be home in an hour. When Timmy arrived home, his mom was already setting the table. The smell of her cooking filled the air, and for a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and just enjoy the familiarity of it all. But it didn't last long. His mom looked up at him, concern written all over her face. Timmy, she said softly, what's going on? I've been hearing things. You're not involved in anything dangerous, are you? Timmy swallowed hard. How could he explain everything to her? How could he put into words the things he had done, the things he had almost become? Timmy started, but his voice faltered. I've made some mistakes, Mom. I've been trying to figure out where I belong, and I got caught up in something I shouldn't have. His mom's face softened, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You don't have to be part of something dangerous to belong, Timmy. You have a family here. You always have. Tears stung at Timmy's eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. All he could do was nod, realizing that his mom's love was the one constant he had left, the one thing that could pull him back from the edge. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if he would ever truly escape the pull of the biker world. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of his mom's kitchen and the love she had always shown him, Timmy realized that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back. Timmy sat at the dinner table, his hands wrapped tightly around his mug of coffee, his mind still processing everything that had happened over the past few days. The taste of his mom's cooking, something warm and familiar, felt like a fleeting reminder of the life he had left behind. The warmth of the kitchen didn't quite match the coldness gnawing at him from the inside. His mom was across from him, her brow furrowed in concern as she carefully placed a plate of food in front of him. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of silverware. But even in this peaceful setting, Timmy couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something he wasn't ready for. "So," his mom said softly, breaking the silence, "tell me everything. I know you're not ready to talk about it, but I can't stand seeing you like this. Something's changed in you, Timmy. I know it." Timmy's eyes flickered to his mother, her voice gentle, coaxing, but with an unmistakable urgency. She wasn't angry, not yet, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Her unspoken question was clear. "What's happening to you?" Taking a deep breath, Timmy set down his mug, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. His whole life, he'd been taught to be strong, to make decisions for himself. But now, faced with his mother's concern and the reality of his choices, he felt like a child again, searching for answers. I don't know how to explain it, Mom," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I got in too deep. I thought I could handle it, but the deeper I went, the more I realized it was never about me. It was always about power, control. I thought I could leave, but there are strings tied to me, and I don't know how to cut them." His mom listened in silence, her eyes never leaving his. Timmy could see the pain in her gaze as she absorbed the weight of his words. She wanted to fix it, to take away the burden from him. But Timmy knew this was something he had to face alone. "You don't have to carry it all alone," his mom finally said, her voice steady. "I know it's hard, but you don't have to do this by yourself. We're family, and I believe you can make it through." Timmy felt a lump rise in his throat. Her words meant more than she would ever know. She wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. She just wanted him to come back to her, to come back to the family. I don't know if I can go back, Mom. The things I've seen, the things I've done. I don't even recognize myself anymore." She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You may not recognize yourself now, but I know you, Timmy. And you've always had a heart of gold. That's not something you lose, no matter what." Her words hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he felt the tears he had been holding back start to break free. He didn't want to cry, didn't want to feel weak in front of her, but it was impossible to hold back the flood of emotions that had been building inside him. "I'm scared, Mom," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can escape it. I don't know if I'll ever be free of them." His mom squeezed his hand tighter, her grip firm and reassuring. "You can be free, Timmy, but you have to let go. You have to trust that you don't need them to define who you are." Timmy looked up at his mom, her words sinking deep into his soul. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his life and find his way out of the mess he had created. Later that evening, after dinner, Timmy stood outside on the porch, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He stared up at the night sky, the stars flickering like tiny beacons in the dark. He thought about the bikers, about Jake, and the promises he had made. Promises that now felt like chains around his wrists. What had he been thinking? The bikers weren't his family. They weren't the answer. The longer he thought about it, the more he realized how far he had fallen into their world, how easily he had let it consume him. But he wasn't that person anymore. Timmy closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the chill of the night air filling his lungs. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding from the truth. He had to face it, no matter how hard it was. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, He heard the sound of a motorcycle approaching. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. Timmy tensed, his heart rate quickening. It wasn't the sound of a familiar bike, not like the ones the bikers used. This was different. He turned just as the motorcycle pulled into the driveway. It wasn't one of the bikers. In fact, Timmy didn't recognize the rider at all. The man on the bike was tall, with a rugged, worn face, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. The bike came to a stop, and the man swung off, walking toward Timmy with purpose. There was something in his stride that made Timmy's stomach tighten. This was someone who didn't come to make friends. This was someone who had a message to deliver. "Timmy," the man said, his voice gruff and direct. "We need to talk." Timmy stood frozen, not knowing how to respond. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't recognize the man, but there was something in the way he spoke that made it clear. This wasn't a coincidence. The man stepped closer, and Timmy's instincts screamed at him to run. But there was nowhere to go. "We know what you did, kid," the man continued, "and you're not getting out of this that easy." Timmy's heart skipped a beat as the man in the dark sunglasses stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could feel the tension building in the air, thick and palpable. Every muscle in Timmy's body screamed at him to run, but he stood frozen in place, unsure of what to expect next. "Who are you?" Timmy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He hadn't seen the man with the bikers before, and there was no way this was just a random encounter. The man stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable behind the dark sunglasses. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though the air had thickened, hanging heavily between them. Timmy's pulse quickened as he felt the man's eyes on him, even though they were hidden behind the glasses. The silence felt like a warning. "I'm someone you don't want to mess with," the man said finally, his tone low and deliberate. "I'm here because you made a decision. A decision that affects more than just you, kid." Timmy swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the man's words, and they settled heavily on his shoulders. What did he mean by that? What decision was he talking about? Had Timmy's choice to walk away from the bikers really set something in motion that he couldn't stop? Before Timmy could respond, the man took another step closer. "You don't get to walk away from this. The moment you decided to back out, you signed up for the consequences. The bikers don't let go of their own that easily." The mention of the bikers sent a chill down Timmy's spine. He had hoped, desperately, that by stepping away from them, he could start over, make a fresh start. But here it was, the reality he had feared all along. The bikers weren't going to let him go that easily. They were going to drag him back into their world, whether he liked it or not. "I didn't want any part of it anymore," Timmy said, his voice shaking. "I thought I could walk away." "You can't just walk away from a life like that, kid," the man replied, a cruel edge to his voice. "You were in too deep, and now you've pissed off the wrong people." Timmy's thoughts raced as he tried to process what the man was saying. Was it too late to undo everything? Was there any way to get out of the mess he had gotten himself into? "I'm done," Timmy said, more forcefully this time, despite the fear gnawing at him. "I don't want anything to do with you or them anymore. I'm not afraid of you." The man chuckled, the sound dark and menacing. "You don't have to be afraid of me, kid. You should be worried about what's coming next. We're not the ones you should be scared of." Timmy's eyes narrowed, his confusion deepening. What was he talking about? Who was he really working for? Before Timmy could ask another question, the man stepped back, pulling a small phone from his pocket. He tapped something on the screen, then held it out to Timmy. "You think you can just walk away, huh? Here's a little reality check for you," the man said, his voice colder now. "This is what happens when you turn your back on us." Timmy hesitated, eyeing the phone. The screen lit up with an image, a grainy but unmistakable video of him from the night he had confronted the bikers in the warehouse. He had thought no one had been watching, but clearly someone had been. The video showed him talking to Jake, then to the bikers, and ultimately walking away from it all. "This is your future now," the man said, his voice carrying a dangerous finality. "This video's already been shared. The bikers are going to see it, and they're going to know what you did. You're a target now, Timmy. You can't hide from this. Timmy's stomach twisted as the weight of the situation hit him all at once. He had thought he could just walk away. But now he realized that the moment he had stepped into the world of the bikers, he had become a part of something much bigger than himself. Something that couldn't just be erased with a few simple decisions. The man turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the night as he walked back toward the motorcycle. You're going to regret not finishing what you started, kid, he called over his shoulder. But you're going to have to deal with it, one way or another. Timmy stood in the driveway. The image on the phone burned into his mind. He had thought he was doing the right thing, walking away, but now he saw how deep the mess really went. There was no escaping it. The bikers had already made their move. The following day, Timmy tried to shake the feeling of dread that hung over him. He went through the motions, getting ready for work, checking his messages, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But the weight of the man's words lingered in his mind, growing heavier with each passing hour. By the time he got home, the evening was already setting in, and he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was waiting for him. He entered the house, looking around. It was too quiet. His mom was in the kitchen, but she was busy chopping vegetables, her back to him. Timmy took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with worry. "I think we need to talk." She turned, her face lighting up when she saw him, but Timmy could tell there was something different in her eyes. She sensed it too. "Something's happened, hasn't it?" she asked softly, setting the knife down and walking toward him. Her gaze searched his face, and for a moment, they just stood there, the words unsaid hanging heavily between them. Timmy hesitated, not sure how to break it to her, how to explain the danger that was closing in around him. He didn't want her to worry. He didn't want her to feel the fear he was feeling, but he couldn't hide the truth anymore. The bikers weren't going to let him go, and the worst part was, they weren't the only threat he had to worry about. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming for me, Mom, and I don't know what to do." Timmy sat at the kitchen table, his hands gripping the sides of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was spinning, thoughts colliding in a chaotic blur of fear and uncertainty. How had everything gotten so out of hand so quickly? The man from the bikers had delivered his message, and it had left a permanent scar on Timmy's mind. He couldn't shake the image of the video, of the bikers seeing him turn his back on them, and the consequences that would follow. His mom, sensing the shift in the air, set the table down in front of him. The smell of fresh food filled the room, but it did little to settle his nerves. She had already sensed something was wrong. She always did. But she wasn't asking for details yet. She could tell by the way Timmy's eyes were focused somewhere far beyond her that something had shifted. "Timmy," his mom started, her voice soft, but there was an edge to it. She had always known how to read him, and right now, he could see the concern rising in her eyes. What's really going on? He didn't know where to start, didn't know how to tell her that the life he had tried to leave behind was coming for him, and worse yet, he was dragging her into it. He wanted to say that everything was going to be okay, that he'd handle it, but the words wouldn't come. There was no way out now. "Mom," Timmy finally said, his voice low, "I thought I could get away from all of it. I thought I could walk away from the bikers and start over. But I can't. I can't escape it. They won't let me." She sat down beside him, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, grounding him in a way nothing else could. "You don't have to fight this alone, Timmy," she said gently. "I'm right here with you." Timmy looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. "But you don't understand. They know what I did. They know I walked away. And that's not something they forgive." His mom took a deep breath. She wasn't angry, but her expression was hardening, as if preparing herself for something she couldn't quite name. "You don't have to be afraid of them, Timmy. You can't let fear control you. We'll figure this out, but you have to trust me. You have to trust that we can handle it together." Timmy wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they could just pack up and leave, that he could disappear and somehow erase the last few months of his life. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible that seemed. The bikers weren't the only threat. He had no idea who else was involved in this world he had tried to escape. I don't know if I can get out of this," Timmy whispered, looking at the floor. It's bigger than me now. Just as the words left his lips, a loud knock echoed through the door. It was sudden and sharp, sending a jolt through both of them. Timmy froze, his breath catching in his throat. The knock wasn't a polite tap or a knock from a neighbor. It was the kind of knock that meant trouble. The kind of knock he had been dreading since the moment he made the decision to walk away. His mom stood up quickly, her expression tense. "Stay here," she said firmly. "Don't open the door." Timmy watched in a daze as his mom walked toward the door, her steps purposeful but cautious. She glanced at him once more, her eyes filled with silent warnings. She was trying to protect him, but he knew that nothing was going to stop whatever was coming. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, gravelly, familiar, but cold. "Timmy," the voice called out, deep and commanding. "I know you're in there." Timmy's stomach twisted, recognizing the voice. It was one of the bikers. It was Jake. The thought sent a cold chill down his spine. How had they found him so quickly? What did they want now? His mom hesitated, looking back at him, but she didn't say anything. Timmy could see the worry in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. Neither of them knew what was going to happen next. Timmy stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew there was no avoiding this, no way to escape. They were here, and he had to face them, no matter the cost. "I'll handle this," Timmy said, his voice more confident than he felt. "Just stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone else, okay?" His mom didn't argue, but Timmy could tell she wasn't convinced. She stood still, watching him with a worried expression. He gave her a nod, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure more, her or himself. He moved toward the door, his legs heavy with dread, but he knew there was no turning back. Not now. Timmy opened the door just enough to see Jake standing there, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Behind him, a few more bikers stood, their motorcycles parked in the driveway, the sound of their engines still rumbling in the distance. The air around them felt thick with menace. "Well, well, well," Jake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Thought you could just walk away, huh? Thought you could just quit on us?" Timmy clenched his jaw, refusing to let Jake see how much fear had taken root inside him. He stood tall, trying to appear unshaken, but inside, his heart was racing. "I didn't want any part of this," Timmy said, his voice low but firm. "You know that." Jake's smile faltered for a moment, and the air grew heavier, the tension stretching thin. "You made a mistake, Timmy. You think you can just back out and everything's going to be fine? That's not how this works." Timmy's pulse raced, his thoughts running wild. What were they going to do to him now? He thought he could escape, but the bikers weren't done with him. Not by a long shot. Jake stepped forward, his gaze darkening. "You owe us, Timmy. You don't get to run away and leave all of this behind. You're coming with us. And you're going to fix this." Timmy's world seemed to narrow down to the coldness in Jake's eyes. He wasn't sure what they had planned, but he could tell that whatever it was, it wouldn't be something he could easily escape. He swallowed hard, knowing that this was the moment that would define everything. Timmy stood in the doorway, his body stiff with fear, but he refused to let the bikers see how terrified he was. Jake and the others were right in front of him, their presence imposing, making the small space around him feel even tighter, more suffocating. The engines of their motorcycles rumbled in the background like a distant thunderstorm, ready to break. Jake took another step forward, his boots clicking against the porch. "You think you're just going to get away from us like that? You don't walk away from this kind of life, Timmy. You don't get to just leave us in the dust and expect everything to be okay. You owe us more than that." Timmy's fists clenched by his sides. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the reality of his situation was crashing down on him. He had no power here. These men were dangerous, and they didn't just take no for an answer. His mind raced, trying to find an out, some way to push back, but nothing came. "I'm done with this," Timmy finally said, his voice strained but steady. "I don't owe you anything. I'm not your property." Jake's smirk deepened. "You might not think so, but that's not how this works. You made your choice when you decided to join us. And now you think you can just walk away without consequences? That's not how this ends, kid. Behind Jake, the other bikers stood with their arms crossed, watching, waiting. Their presence was like a wall, all of them looking at Timmy as though he was nothing more than a pawn in a game they controlled. Timmy looked over his shoulder at his mom, who was still standing inside, peering through the crack in the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She knew what was happening, and she knew there was no easy way out. "Mom, go inside," Timmy said quietly, not taking his eyes off Jake. "Please, just go inside." His mom hesitated for a moment, fear battling with her instinct to protect him. But she gave him one last look, her eyes full of silent concern, before she reluctantly stepped back into the house, closing the door behind her. Jake's eyes flicked toward the door as it closed, and his smirk widened. "That's right. Run home to Mommy. But don't think you're getting out of this, Timmy. You've got a debt to settle, and we're not leaving here until you do." Timmy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't have any debt. I made a mistake, and I'm done. You don't scare me." Jake's expression hardened, the amusement fading from his face. "You think we're here to scare you? We're not here for threats. We're here to make sure you learn your place. You walked away, and now we've come to collect." Timmy's pulse raced. He had no idea what Jake meant by collect, but he didn't think it was anything good. They were making it clear that there was no walking away from them, no going back. He was stuck in this world, and the more he resisted, the more they would drag him down with them. Jake stepped forward again, his voice low and threatening. "You really think you can just quit on us? You want to leave everything behind, but you're not getting off that easy. You don't get to walk away from the bikers. We'll make sure of that." Something inside Timmy snapped. He had spent too long hiding, too long letting fear control him. His fists clenched tighter, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I don't care what you think," Timmy shouted. "I'm done. You can't make me do anything anymore." Jake stopped, his expression flickering for a moment, as if taken aback by Timmy's sudden defiance. But then his eyes narrowed, and he stepped back, signaling for the other bikers to move. "You think you're done, huh?" Jake said slowly. "You think you're going to walk away from all of this? Well, we're going to show you just how wrong you are." The bikers moved as one, surrounding Timmy, their eyes hard, their postures menacing. He could feel the weight of their presence pressing in on him, but he refused to give in. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. "You're nothing without us, Timmy," one of the bikers said, his voice rough, like gravel being crushed underfoot. "You think you can just forget what you were a part of? You're still one of us, whether you like it or not." Timmy's mind raced, but his body remained tense, ready for whatever came next. They were trying to break him, trying to force him back into their fold. But there was something inside him that wouldn't let them win. He wasn't that scared kid anymore. He had fought for his freedom, and he wasn't about to let them take it away from him. "You're wrong," Timmy said, his voice steady but strong. "I'm not one of you. I'm not part of your world. I'm done, and there's nothing you can do to make me go back." For a moment, there was silence, and Timmy felt the weight of the bikers' gazes on him. He knew they were calculating their next move, deciding how far they were willing to push him. Jake's face was unreadable, but he finally broke the silence, his voice cold and hard. "You don't know what you're up against, kid, but you will. You'll regret this." And just like that, the bikers turned and walked away, their motorcycles roaring to life as they revved the engines and drove off, disappearing into the night. Timmy stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. His body was shaking, the weight of everything that had just happened sinking in. He had survived, but for how long? He slowly turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind him. His mom was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You okay?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Timmy nodded, though the truth was far more complicated than he could express. "Yeah, but I don't know for how long." His mom sighed deeply, rubbing her forehead. "We can't just keep running, Timmy. We need to figure out what to do next. We need help." Timmy didn't have an answer. The bikers had made it clear that this wasn't over. The moment he walked away, it set something in motion that he couldn't stop. But he had to find a way out. He had to. The night air felt colder now, each breath Timmy took feeling heavier than the last. His heart was still racing from the encounter, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quiet. What did the bikers mean by, "You'll regret this"? And who else was involved in this world that he had tried to leave behind? Timmy paced around the house, restlessly, the silence around him pressing down like a weight. His mom was still sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, looking more worried than ever. There was nothing more they could do now. The bikers had made their point loud and clear. They weren't done with him. "Mom," Timmy said, breaking the silence, his voice tight with urgency, "I can't just sit here and wait for them to come back. We need a plan. We can't just hide." His mom raised her eyebrows, the concern in her eyes mixing with a trace of fear. "What do you mean, a plan? What are we supposed to do, Timmy? These men are dangerous. We don't even know what they want from you. I don't know what they're capable of." Timmy clenched his fists. "I don't know either. But I do know that I can't let them control me. I can't let them win. I need to figure out a way to get out of this, once and for all." She hesitated, chewing her lip. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Timmy. These people, they don't play by the rules. You're not dealing with the same world as you were before. You can't fight them alone." Timmy looked at her, a knot forming in his stomach. She was right. This wasn't some petty high school rivalry or a neighborhood bully. The bikers were part of something far bigger, something darker and more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. But what choice did he have? He couldn't just keep running. "I know," Timmy said, his voice soft. "I can't do this alone, but I have to try." His mom looked at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Then we need help. But we have to be careful who we trust, Timmy. You don't know what kind of people we're dealing with. The wrong person could make things worse." Timmy didn't have an answer for that. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't do nothing. His heart was racing again, and he needed to think, to do something before the bikers came back for round two. He turned and grabbed his jacket from the coat rack, heading for the door. "I'll figure it out," he said quietly. "I won't let them win." "Timmy," his mom called, but he was already out the door, the cold night air rushing to meet him. Timmy didn't know where to go. His mind kept circling back to the bikers, to Jake's threatening words, and to the strange feeling in his gut that told him things were about to get a lot worse before they got any better. He couldn't go to the police. He knew better than that. The bikers had connections, and going to the authorities would only escalate things. Instead, he did what he had never thought he would have to do. He thought about the one person who might understand the situation, someone who had been there before, someone who wasn't afraid of the kind of people Timmy was up against. Timmy's hands trembled as he dialed the number. It was a last resort, but it was all he had. The phone rang twice before the voice on the other end picked up. "Yeah." Timmy swallowed hard. "It's Timmy. I need help. I don't know who else to turn to." There was a long pause, and Timmy could hear the person on the other end exhale slowly, as if trying to figure out if he was being pranked. "Timmy, is this for real?" the voice asked, sounding a little incredulous. Timmy nodded, even though the person couldn't see him. "It's real. The bikers, they're back. They're after me. They're not just gonna let me walk away." The person on the other end let out a low whistle. "Well, kid, you've done it now. You've burned a bridge with the wrong people." "I know," Timmy said, his voice filled with regret, "but I don't know what to do. I can't do this alone. Please, I need help." The person sighed, and for a moment, Timmy wasn't sure if they were going to offer any kind of assistance or just hang up. But then, the voice softened, almost begrudgingly. "All right, I can help you. But you need to understand something. This isn't gonna be easy. The bikers you're dealing with, they don't play nice. You'll need to be smart, stay low, and follow my instructions, okay?" Timmy's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe this was actually happening. Someone was willing to help. "Yeah," Timmy replied, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do." "I'll be in touch," the voice said before hanging up, and Timmy stood there in the quiet, trying to gather himself. He had made a dangerous call, but it was the only choice he had left. His world had just turned upside down, but maybe, just maybe, this was the lifeline he needed. The next morning, Timmy found himself sitting at the edge of his bed, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He hadn't heard anything from the person he had called yet, but his gut told him the help was coming. He had to be ready. But as he stared at his reflection in the small mirror above his dresser, he realized something. Even if he did get help, even if he found a way to protect himself, there was something bigger than the bikers at play here. They weren't just after him because he had left their group. They were after him because they saw something in him, something they wanted to control. Timmy had tried to escape their grip once, but now he knew that escape wasn't the answer. The only way to survive was to fight back, and to fight smarter. But first, he needed to find out who was really pulling the strings. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Timmy got the call. He had barely slept, his thoughts racing through every possible scenario, wondering what kind of help he was going to get and who exactly was willing to stick their neck out for him. The message on his phone was simple, but it carried a weight of urgency that made his heart race. Meet me at the old warehouse by the train tracks. Midnight. Come alone. That was it. No name, no explanation. Just the promise of help that Timmy wasn't sure he fully understood. But one thing was clear. He didn't have time to waste. The bikers would be back, and if they found out he was making plans, there would be no way out. He took a deep breath and grabbed his jacket, checking to make sure he had everything he needed. The last thing he wanted was to walk into a trap, but he had no choice. This could be his only chance. As the night fell, Timmy found himself standing in front of a dilapidated warehouse, the steel structure barely visible in the moonlight. The air was heavy with the scent of old concrete and rust, and the eerie silence of the place sent a chill through his spine. He glanced around nervously, but no one seemed to be watching. He didn't know what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. An empty, abandoned building that felt like it had been forgotten by time. He didn't even know why this place had been chosen. There were better, safer spots to meet. Timmy checked his phone again. Midnight. Still a few minutes to go. His hand clenched around the device, but he forced himself to take deep breaths and steady his nerves. This was the moment. This was his shot at getting out of this mess. Just as the minute hand on his watch ticked to midnight, a sound broke the stillness. A motorcycle engine revved, followed by the unmistakable sound of a bike coming to a stop. Timmy's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the last thing he wanted was for someone to show up with hostile intentions. The rider stepped off, the leather jacket they wore gleaming under the moonlight, and Timmy tensed up, his instinct telling him to run. But instead, he stood his ground, watching as the person removed their helmet, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with striking, sharp features. She wasn't anyone Timmy recognized, but the presence she carried made it clear that she wasn't someone to be trifled with. "You're Timmy, right?" she asked, her voice low but steady, with an edge of authority that sent a chill down his spine. Timmy nodded cautiously, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I'm Timmy. Who are you?" She gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Name's Casey. I was asked to help you." She took a step forward, scanning the area around them, as though making sure no one was listening. "And believe me, this isn't just about helping you. This is bigger than you think." Timmy frowned, confused. "What do you mean? I thought you were just gonna—" "Listen," Casey interrupted, her voice firm. "The bikers you're dealing with? They're part of something much larger than a small gang. They're tied to a network, a bigger operation that runs through this entire region. What you're dealing with is bigger than just some guys who think they can intimidate you into submission. They've got connections. They've got power." Timmy's stomach twisted with dread. He had been afraid of something like this, but hearing it out loud made the reality of his situation hit him like a ton of bricks. "But why me?" Timmy asked, trying to wrap his head around everything. "Why are they after me? What do they want?" Casey's gaze turned cold, her eyes narrowing. "That's the real question, isn't it? You're not just some random kid they picked out of nowhere. There's something about you, something they think you have, or something they think you know. And right now, you're in their sights. If you don't figure it out soon, you won't be able to outrun them." Timmy's head was spinning. He had never expected anything like this. The bikers had always felt like a local problem, something that could be avoided if he kept his head down. But now he was hearing that they were part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Casey took a step closer, her voice softening just slightly. I know it's a lot to take in, Timmy, but right now, your best chance at surviving this is working with me. And trust me when I say that I've been through much worse than you're dealing with. You don't want to do this alone. Timmy looked at her, weighing his options. He had no idea who she was or why she was willing to help, but one thing was clear. She knew more about the situation than he did, and right now, that made her his best option. Okay, Timmy said, finally making a decision. What do I need to do? Casey's lips curled into a brief smile, and she nodded. First things first, we need to get you out of here. I can't protect you if you're just sitting around waiting for them to find you. I have a few people who can help, but you have to trust me, and you have to be willing to listen. Timmy hesitated, but something in her tone made him feel like this was the only way forward. If he didn't take the risk now, he might not have another chance. All right, he said, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. I'm in. Casey studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp as if she was sizing him up. Finally, she nodded and motioned for him to follow her. Good. Let's get moving. The sooner we're out of here, the better. Timmy didn't ask any more questions. He followed her without hesitation, stepping into the darkness, knowing that whatever came next, he was no longer alone in this fight. Timmy's mind raced as he followed Casey through the dark, quiet streets. The night seemed to swallow them whole as they moved through alleyways and side streets, each one feeling like another step deeper into a world he wasn't prepared for. The weight of everything that had happened so far pressed heavily on his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now in over his head. As they neared the edge of town, the streets grew quieter and the buildings more isolated. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where secrets were buried under the surface, and where anyone could disappear if they weren't careful. Casey led him to a small, nondescript van parked in the shadows of an abandoned lot. Timmy glanced around, wary of any onlookers, but the area seemed deserted. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching them. This is it, Casey said as she opened the side door of the van. Get in. We need to move quickly. Timmy hesitated for a moment, then slid into the back of the van, his heart pounding. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so on edge, so completely out of control. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand exactly what was going on, but Casey had made it clear that he didn't have the luxury of time. As soon as Timmy was inside, Casey slammed the door shut and jumped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and they were off, speeding through the empty streets. Timmy couldn't help but notice how skilled Casey was behind the wheel. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. She knew exactly where she was going, and she wasn't interested in any distractions. He wanted to ask about the bikers, about who she was really working for, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just sat back, trying to stay calm as they sped away from the town. After what felt like an eternity of winding roads and darkened streets, Casey finally slowed the van, bringing it to a stop in front of a rundown building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The air around them was thick with a sense of danger, and Timmy could feel his stomach tighten. This is where it gets real, Casey said, her voice low. Inside is where the real work starts. You're going to meet some people who know more about the bikers than you can imagine. They'll help us figure out who's behind all this. Timmy nodded, trying to steady his nerves. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was certain. He couldn't back out now. His past had already caught up with him, and there was no turning back. They stepped out of the van, and Casey led him inside the building. The door creaked as it opened, and Timmy was immediately hit with the smell of stale air and something else, something metallic. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves filled with what looked like random supplies. But Timmy had a sinking feeling that this place wasn't as harmless as it seemed. Casey led him down a narrow hallway, and as they walked deeper into the building, the sound of voices echoed from a room at the end. Timmy's footsteps faltered for a moment, but he pushed through, following her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. A group of people stood around a table covered in maps, photographs, and notes. Their faces were hard and unreadable, their eyes sharp as they turned to acknowledge Casey's arrival. There were 4 of them, all wearing clothes that blended into the shadows, as if they didn't want to be seen by the wrong people. "This is Timmy," Casey said, motioning toward him. "He's the one the bikers are after. We need to know everything we can about them. What they want, who's running the show." The room went silent as the group studied Timmy. One man, older than the rest with a grizzled face and a deep scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "You're sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "You're about to walk into something you don't fully understand. Once you step into this world, there's no going back." Timmy swallowed hard. He didn't have a choice anymore. He was already in this world, whether he liked it or not. "I'm ready," Timmy said, his voice steady. "I need to know who's behind the bikers and how to stop them." The man nodded slowly. "All right, you might be in luck. We've been tracking these guys for a while, but they've been careful. Too careful. They've got layers of protection. Layers you won't be able to see unless you know how to look." Timmy looked around the room, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. These people didn't seem like the kind of people who gave second chances. They were in the business of getting things done, no matter the cost. One of the women at the table, younger than the others, but with a look of cold calculation in her eyes, spoke up. "The bikers have a network. It's more than just a few outlaws. They have connections in the city, law enforcement, business, even some politicians. If you want to get to them, you'll have to be smart. You'll have to move quickly." Timmy's mind was spinning. This was so much bigger than he had thought. The bikers weren't just after him because he had crossed them. They were part of something larger, something that touched every corner of the city. "How do I fight back?" Timmy asked, his voice steady despite the fear that churned inside him. "What do I need to do?" The older man stepped forward again, placing a hand on Timmy's shoulder. "You don't fight back like this, kid. You'll be eaten alive. You need to be strategic. We're going to help you take them down, but it's going to take patience, planning, and a hell of a lot of guts." Timmy nodded, feeling a new sense of resolve building inside him. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't fight back now, he would lose everything. Timmy couldn't help but feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. The group around him, the ones Casey had called to help him, had a quiet intensity that made his skin crawl. They weren't just knowledgeable about the bikers. They were a part of something much larger, something that had its fingers in every corner of the city. They didn't waste time. The older man, who had introduced himself as Mitch, moved to a table piled high with photos and documents. He swept aside a few papers, revealing a detailed map of the city, with several points marked in red. Timmy's eyes darted across it, noticing the landmarks. Abandoned buildings, empty lots, and even some locations that seemed completely random at first glance. "This," Mitch said, tapping the map, "is what we've gathered so far. These are the biker hangouts, the places they do business. We've been tracking them, but they're good at covering their tracks. We need to get inside these locations if we're going to understand who's really behind them." Timmy leaned forward, trying to take in everything they were saying. What kind of business are they running? Drugs? Extortion? Mitch gave him a pointed look. "It's not that simple. They're into all sorts of illegal activities, drug trafficking, smuggling, even human trafficking. But there's something bigger going on here. Someone higher up in the food chain is pulling the strings, and they've got resources that make it hard to track them down." Timmy felt a sick, knot twist in his stomach. He had known the bikers were dangerous, but this was a whole other level. He had thought they were just a local gang, something he could dodge or outrun. But what Mitch was telling him painted a much darker picture. Casey, who had been silently observing the conversation, finally spoke up. "We've tried hitting their operations from the outside, but they've been moving too fast. We need someone on the inside. That's where you come in, Timmy." Timmy's heart skipped a beat. "What? Inside how?" She looked at him with a steady gaze. "The bikers trust you now. They've got you on their radar. That's the only advantage we have right now. If you play it right, you can get close to them, get access to the information we need." Timmy swallowed hard, the reality of what she was asking sinking in. "You want me to work with them?" "We don't have a choice," Mitch interjected. "It's the only way we can get the intel we need to take them down. We've tried everything else. This is our last shot." Timmy's mind raced. The idea of working with the bikers, of getting closer to the people who had been terrorizing him and his family, made his stomach churn. But what other choice did he have? They were right. If he didn't take action, he'd just be another target, another victim. I don't know if I can do this, Timmy muttered, looking down at his hands. I don't know how to get close to them, how to gain their trust. I'm just a kid. Casey stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. You're not just a kid, Timmy. You're someone they've already underestimated. You've survived this long, and you can do it again. But we're going to need to play this carefully. You need to think like them, act like them, and you need to keep your head. Timmy nodded slowly, trying to ignore the rising panic in his chest. The thought of pretending to be one of them, of getting involved in their world, terrified him. But the truth was, he had no other choice. If he didn't take this chance, the bikers would eventually close in on him, and there would be no way out. All right, Timmy said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll do it. The group around him nodded, the tension in the room palpable as they realized that the stakes had just been raised. They weren't just fighting to protect one boy anymore. They were fighting to take down a criminal network that had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of the city that no one even noticed it anymore. Mitch looked at Timmy, his eyes serious. You need to start gathering information. We'll be watching you, but you can't trust anyone else. Not even the people you think are on your side. If they find out what you're really doing, they won't hesitate to kill you. Timmy's breath hitched, the gravity of the situation becoming clearer with each passing moment. His mind flashed back to his school, to the gang of bikers who had followed him through the streets, to the terrifying sense of power they wielded. He wasn't just playing a dangerous game anymore. He was putting everything on the line. Casey placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but reassuring. You've got this, Timmy. We'll guide you through it. Just remember, we're all in this together. We'll help you every step of the way. Timmy nodded, even though doubts still gnawed at him. All right, let's do this. The days following Timmy's decision felt like a blur. Every moment he spent thinking about what lay ahead made his stomach twist with anxiety. The weight of the task ahead hung over him like a shadow, threatening to consume him before he even stepped into the field. But he had made a promise, and promises, Timmy knew, were all that separated him from the life he had left behind. Casey and Mitch had given him the basics, a rough outline of what he needed to do, a list of places to visit, people to watch. But the specifics? That was on him. They had warned him. Nothing would be easy, and nothing was certain. Timmy had to move carefully, like a ghost in their world, never too visible but always present. On the third day, Timmy found himself standing in front of a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, one of the marked locations on the map Mitch had given him. The place was desolate, rusty metal doors, broken windows, and a general air of neglect. But there was something about it that felt alive. The muffled hum of motorcycles, the faint voices coming from within, told him that this wasn't just any abandoned building. This was a biker hideout. Timmy glanced around the parking lot. A few motorcycles were scattered across the dirt, their chrome glinting dully in the midday sun. He recognized one of the bikes from the gang that had been following him, red and black with a custom flame design on the tank. His heart skipped a beat. There was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and approached the entrance, trying to act calm, trying to blend in. He had to look like he belonged here. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a burly man with tattoos covering his arms and a menacing glare in his eyes. Timmy swallowed hard but kept his voice steady. I'm here to talk to someone in charge, he said, forcing his voice to remain calm, though it shook inside. The man eyed him up and down before grunting. You got a name? Timmy. A beat passed. The man seemed to consider him for a moment before stepping aside. All right, kid. Follow me. Timmy walked into the warehouse, doing his best to look unassuming. The interior was just as grim as the outside. Rows of motorcycles lined the walls, and the scent of gasoline and leather lingered in the air. A few bikers stood around a table, engaged in a hushed conversation. The low rumble of distant engines added to the atmosphere of tension. The man who had let Timmy in led him toward a corner of the room where a tall, broad-shouldered figure stood with his back to them, his hands resting on the edge of a workbench covered in parts. "You got business with me?" The voice was gruff, and it carried a weight of authority. Timmy's pulse quickened, but he steeled himself. "I'm looking for a job," he said, trying to sound confident, like he had done this 100 times before. The man turned around slowly, and Timmy's breath caught in his throat. The biker's face was scarred, a patch of rough stubble covering his jaw, and a cruel sneer played at the corner of his lips. His eyes, however, were cold, calculating. "Kid," the man said, narrowing his eyes, "you sure about that?" Timmy nodded. "I've got a score to settle, and I heard you guys might be interested in a new recruit. I've got skills." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. All right, let's see if you're worth anything. Follow me." Timmy's heart thudded in his chest as he followed the biker to a back room. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He could feel the heat of his palms, the sting of sweat on his brow. He couldn't afford to show any weakness now. They reached a room at the far end of the warehouse, where a few other bikers were gathered around a table. The room had a heavy atmosphere, thick with smoke and tension. A man in a leather jacket stood at the center of the group, his eyes flicking up as Timmy entered. "Who's this?" the man asked, his tone casual but commanding. "New blood," the biker who'd led Timmy in replied. The man in the jacket studied Timmy for a moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, kid. We'll see what you've got. We've got some business to take care of." Timmy's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what business meant in this world, but he couldn't back out now. He had made it this far, and backing out wasn't an option. He had to survive this. The man pointed to a stack of crates in the corner of the room. "Unload those. Show us what you can do." Timmy's mind raced as he moved toward the crates. This was it, the first test. He had no idea what was in those crates, but he had to act like he belonged, like this was just another day in the life of a biker. His hands trembled slightly as he began to move the crates, pretending to know exactly what he was doing, trying to project confidence even though he had none. He could feel the eyes of the other bikers on him, sizing him up, judging his every move. Each action had to be perfect. If he slipped up, even for a moment, they would see him for what he was, a kid playing in a world he didn't belong in. Timmy took a deep breath, focused, and carried the crates across the room with the same steady pace he'd seen the bikers use. He had to keep moving, keep pretending. The man in the jacket watched him for a moment, then grunted in approval. "Not bad, kid. Not bad at all." Timmy's heart settled, just a little. He had passed the first test, but he knew that wasn't enough. This was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Timmy's days in the warehouse grew longer as he became more entangled in the bikers' world. He learned quickly that their operations weren't just about muscle and intimidation. There was a dark rhythm to everything. The way they operated, the way they spoke in hushed tones, and the way they conducted business. The bikers weren't just a gang. They were a network, a web of connections that stretched far beyond the city's borders. At first, Timmy kept his head down, doing menial tasks, moving crates, cleaning up the warehouse, and helping with whatever else they threw his way. Every day felt like a test, one that he wasn't sure he could pass. He was constantly watched, never given a moment's peace. It wasn't just about proving himself to them. It was about survival. One evening, Mitch called him, the voice on the other end tight with urgency. "Timmy, listen carefully," Mitch said. "We've been tracking their movements. We know they've been smuggling goods into the city, but there's something else going on. We don't know what it is yet, but it's big." Timmy felt his pulse quicken. "What do you need me to do?" "We need you to get close to their leader. His name's Tony, Ironclad Marshall. He's the one pulling the strings here, and if you can get to him, we might be able to figure out what they're really planning." Timmy's mind raced. Getting close to Tony was a dangerous proposition. Tony wasn't just a biker. He was a powerhouse, a ruthless figure in the underground world. He had a reputation for being cold-blooded, and no one ever dared to cross him. "Tony is untouchable," Timmy muttered, almost to himself. "I know," Mitch said, his voice grim. "That's why we need you. You're in a position to get close to him. You're already inside, and they're starting to trust you. But you need to be careful. If you do anything that raises suspicion, it could all fall apart. You have to keep your cover. Timmy's thoughts raced, the enormity of the task weighing down on him. He had been surviving day by day, but getting close to Tony was a whole new level. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up this facade without being found out. "I'll do it," Timmy said, the words feeling like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "But I need more information. What exactly do you want me to look for?" Mitch hesitated. "Anything, but especially what they're smuggling. We need to know who they're working with. If we can tie Tony to a bigger operation, we can bring him down." Timmy agreed to meet with Mitch later that night to discuss the plan further. The clock was ticking, and time was running out. The next day, Timmy was put to work running errands for the gang. His task: deliver a package to a meeting spot across town. It seemed simple enough, just another errand. But as he made his way to the location, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He arrived at the agreed-upon spot, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was desolate, abandoned for years, with shattered windows and graffiti covering the walls. A black SUV was parked nearby, the engine running as two men stood beside it, waiting. Timmy approached cautiously, but the men didn't look at him at first. They were busy talking, too engaged in their own conversation to notice him. "Here to drop off the goods?" one of the men finally asked, his voice gruff. Timmy nodded, trying to keep his composure. "Yeah, that's me." The man glanced at the package in Timmy's hands before nodding. "Give it to me." Timmy handed over the package without a word, his mind racing. Something didn't feel right. The men's unease, the way they kept glancing around. It was as if they were expecting someone. He decided to take a risk. "Who else is coming?" Timmy asked casually, trying to gauge their response. The men exchanged a quick glance before one of them answered. "You don't need to know that, kid. Just do your job and get out of here." Timmy nodded, trying to act nonchalant, but inside, a sense of dread was creeping over him. He had learned enough to know when something was amiss. The bikers were secretive, but this felt different. Too much tension, too much secrecy. As Timmy turned to leave, he heard the hum of an engine. Glancing back, he saw a motorcycle speeding toward him, its rider cloaked in black leather, the helmet obscuring their face. Timmy's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the bike. It was Tony's. The motorcycle screeched to a halt in front of the SUV. The rider dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning the area before turning to the two men. "Everything go according to plan?" Tony's voice was low, dangerous, as he approached. One of the men nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "Yeah, boss. All good." Tony eyed them both before turning his attention back to Timmy, his gaze piercing. "And you? Did you follow the instructions?" Timmy swallowed hard. This was it. Tony was right in front of him. He had to be careful. He had to keep his cool. "Yeah, no problem," Timmy said, trying to keep his voice steady. Everything went fine. Tony didn't say anything for a long moment, just staring at Timmy with those cold, calculating eyes. Finally, he grunted, "Good. You did all right." Timmy's chest tightened. That was all he needed, just enough to stay in their good graces. But Tony's next words sent a shiver down his spine. "Don't think I'm not watching you, kid. One wrong move, and you'll regret it." Timmy nodded, keeping his head down. "I won't disappoint you, Tony." With that, Tony turned and walked back to his bike, leaving Timmy standing in the cold evening air. As the motorcycle roared to life and sped off into the distance, Timmy felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had survived this encounter, but just barely. Timmy spent the next few days walking a tightrope. His every move was scrutinized, and every word he spoke had to be measured. With Tony now taking a personal interest in him, the pressure was mounting. Every time Timmy thought he had his footing, another test came his way, each more difficult than the last. The warehouse became his world. It was a place full of noise, danger, and unspoken rules. The bikers' activities seemed endless, hauling goods, meeting shady contacts, and planning heists. Timmy knew it was only a matter of time before he'd be asked to do something more dangerous, something he couldn't hide from. It was on the fourth day after his encounter with Tony that he was called in to see him again. The sun was beginning to set when Timmy received the summons. Mitch had warned him to be ready for anything, and this felt like the moment he had been dreading. He hadn't even had time to gather his thoughts before he was ushered into the back office of the warehouse. Tony was standing by a window, his back to the door, the only light coming from the fading sun casting long shadows across the room. His presence was as imposing as ever. "You wanted to see me?" Timmy asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Tony turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Timmy's with an unsettling intensity. "Yeah, kid. I've been watching you. You've been doing good work, better than I expected." Timmy swallowed. "Thanks," he said, his voice betraying none of the tension twisting inside him. Tony walked over to a table in the corner, where a few folded maps and a stack of cash were spread out. He motioned for Timmy to come closer. "I've got a job for you," Tony said flatly. "A big one. This is your chance to prove you're more than just a grunt." Timmy's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment that would define his future with the bikers, or end it. "What's the job?" Timmy asked, trying to keep his nerves in check. Tony looked at him, his gaze sharp. "You're going to help us move a shipment. This isn't just any delivery. We've got something special coming in, and I need someone who can handle it. It's going to require discretion, and it's going to require loyalty. Can I count on you, Timmy?" Timmy hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He had come this far, and backing out now would raise suspicion. The trust Tony had shown him, however small it might have been, could be shattered in an instant if he refused. "Yeah, I'm in," Timmy said, his voice more confident than he felt. Tony's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. You won't regret it. Meet me at the docks at midnight. You'll find out what you're really made of." The hours before midnight crawled by. Timmy paced his small apartment, rehearsing the conversation he'd have with Mitch, the explanation for why he was going to take on such a dangerous task. But there was no way to prepare for what awaited him at the docks. It wasn't just a job, it was a test. And he knew that with every passing minute, he was sinking deeper into a world he didn't understand but couldn't escape. At exactly midnight, Timmy arrived at the designated spot. The docks were eerily quiet, the moon casting an unnatural light over the water, making the entire scene feel surreal. The smell of salt and rust mixed with the faint hum of distant machinery. Timmy stood by a chain-link fence, trying to calm his breathing, when the sound of motorcycle engines cut through the silence. A group of bikers appeared, riding in a formation that made it clear they weren't here for a casual ride. They circled around Timmy, their engines revving loudly as they came to a stop. Tony led the pack, his motorcycle a sleek black beast that glinted in the moonlight. "You ready, kid?" Tony's voice was low, his eyes scanning the area before landing on Timmy. "Yeah," Timmy replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. Tony dismounted and nodded toward a nearby warehouse. "Follow me." Inside, the warehouse was filled with crates. Large, heavy boxes stacked high, their contents unknown. Timmy could feel the tension in the air, a palpable electricity that seemed to hum with every movement. The bikers were on high alert, talking in low voices, their eyes darting around as if they were expecting trouble. "What's in the crates?" Timmy asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Tony gave him a sideways glance, his expression unreadable. "That's none of your concern, kid. You just move the goods. If you ask too many questions, I'll start wondering if you're really one of us." Timmy nodded quickly, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He was just a cog in the machine, nothing more. The minutes stretched into hours as the bikers worked quickly, unloading the crates and loading them onto waiting trucks. Timmy did his part, moving crates and checking for any signs of trouble. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep over him. There was something off about the whole operation. The secrecy, the tight security. It didn't sit right with him. Just as the last crate was being loaded onto a truck, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Timmy's heart skipped a beat as he looked toward the sound, his instincts kicking in. "Get down," Tony barked, grabbing Timmy by the arm and yanking him behind a stack of crates. Gunshots rang out, echoing through the cavernous space. The bikers scrambled for cover, their voices shouting orders, but Timmy could barely process what was happening. All he knew was that this was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when everything went wrong. Stay down, Timmy, Tony shouted over the chaos, pulling his own weapon from beneath his jacket. Timmy did as he was told, crouching low behind the crates, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who was attacking, but it didn't matter. What mattered was survival. He could hear the sounds of men shouting, the roar of gunfire, and the heavy thud of boots hitting the concrete floor. And then, in the midst of it all, Timmy saw a figure moving toward him, silhouetted by the flashing lights of the gunfire. The world around Timmy exploded into chaos. Gunfire ripped through the air, and men shouted orders, their voices muffled by the cacophony of the battle. His heart was pounding, his pulse racing in his ears as he ducked behind the crates, trying to steady his breath. Everything that had felt somewhat under control in his life up until now seemed to crumble in an instant. He could feel the heat from the gunshots as they echoed through the warehouse. It wasn't just the sound that threatened to shatter his nerves, but the realization that everything was spiraling out of his control. He glanced up, trying to get a sense of what was happening. The bikers were scrambling, ducking behind crates, pulling out weapons, and firing back. Some of them had already taken cover, while others were moving in and out of the shadows. It was clear this was no ordinary ambush. It was a well-coordinated attack. Timmy! Tony's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Timmy's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes meeting Tony's as the leader motioned for him to follow. Tony was already moving, heading toward a side exit, his gun raised in one hand. Timmy didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, ducking low to avoid any stray bullets, and sprinted after Tony, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at his gut. His heart hammered as he sprinted through the warehouse, dodging crates and looking for any sign of the attackers. Who were they? Why had they come for the bikers? Was this part of the plan, or had something gone horribly wrong? As they neared the side door, the sounds of gunfire seemed to grow louder, more frantic. Timmy's mind raced, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He couldn't think about who was shooting or why. It was all about survival now. Tony reached the door first and threw it open, pulling Timmy out into the night air. The cold hit Timmy's skin like a slap, but he barely noticed. The danger wasn't over yet. They had to move fast. "Get to the bike," Tony shouted, already rushing toward his motorcycle, parked by the corner of the warehouse. "Now." Timmy followed, every step feeling like it might be his last. He could hear the men shouting inside the warehouse, their voices growing fainter as they moved further away from the chaos. But still, the fear clung to him, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. They reached the motorcycles. Tony threw Timmy a helmet without a word, and Timmy put it on, his hands shaking as he did. Tony started his bike and revved the engine, the loud growl of the motorcycle cutting through the tension-filled night. "Get on," Tony ordered, looking over his shoulder as he revved the engine again. Timmy hesitated for only a moment before climbing onto the back of the bike. He didn't know where they were going, but he didn't care. He just needed to get out of there. The bike roared to life, and they sped off into the night, the world blurring around them. Timmy could barely keep his thoughts straight as the wind whipped past him, the sound of the engine drowning out everything else. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of the city, far away from the warehouse, that Tony slowed the bike and pulled off onto a dirt road. The tension in Timmy's shoulders eased slightly, but it didn't disappear. He didn't know if they were safe yet. For all he knew, this could be the beginning of something far worse. Tony parked the bike and dismounted, turning to Timmy with a hard, calculating look. "You did good," Tony said, his voice cool but not unappreciative. "But don't think this changes anything. You're still on probation." Timmy nodded, not daring to speak. His chest was tight with fear, his head still spinning from the events of the night. They were far from the warehouse now, but the danger still felt too close, too real. "Who were those guys?" Timmy finally asked, his voice hoarse. Tony's face darkened, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then, with a shrug, he said, "Rivals. The Sons of Liberty. They've been trying to muscle in on our territory for months." This was their way of sending a message. Timmy didn't respond. He had heard of the Sons of Liberty before, another gang with a reputation for violence, but hearing about them from Tony, in this context, made the threat feel all the more immediate. It wasn't just about getting by in the world of bikers anymore. This was about survival in a world where betrayal and violence could strike at any moment. Tony took a deep breath and stared off into the distance. The tension in the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. "We need to regroup," Tony said finally. "We can't let them think we're weak. Tomorrow, we'll deal with them. You stick with me, Timmy. You're in deeper now. No turning back." Timmy nodded again, his throat tight. He had come this far, but the realization that he couldn't walk away now hit him like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just about being part of the gang anymore. It was about being trapped in a dangerous game where there were no rules, and loyalty came at a steep price. Tony glanced at him one last time before starting his bike again. "Let's go. We've got a lot of work to do." As they sped off into the night, Timmy's mind churned. He had survived one close call, but he knew that the road ahead would only get more treacherous. He had no choice but to follow Tony's lead, no matter how dangerous it became. The biker's world wasn't kind to anyone who showed weakness, and right now, weakness was the last thing he could afford to show. The ride back to their hideout was silent, save for the roaring engines and the wind whipping past Timmy's ears. His mind was still reeling from the chaotic events at the warehouse. The gunfire, the narrow escape, the realization that he was entangled in a world of violence that was far beyond what he had imagined when he first crossed paths with the bikers. As they pulled into the makeshift garage, Timmy's heart was still racing. The adrenaline that had kept him going was starting to wear off, leaving him with a gnawing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. Tony killed the engine and slid off the bike without saying a word. Timmy followed his lead, his legs unsteady as he stood, his hands trembling slightly. The night air was cool, but it couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a situation he couldn't control, a situation where his every move would be watched. They walked into the small hideout, a dimly lit space filled with mismatched furniture, empty beer cans, and the faint scent of stale smoke. Some of the bikers were already there, talking in low voices, their faces tense. It was clear that the attack had left a mark on everyone. But amidst the quiet chatter, there was an underlying energy of readiness, as if they were all bracing for the next move. Tony turned to Timmy, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be busy." Timmy nodded, but his mind was anything but ready for rest. He had seen too much in the last few hours, the gunfight, the bloodshed, the fear that had been so real it had almost felt like it was suffocating him. And yet, despite all that, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was waiting for him just around the corner. As Tony disappeared into the back room, Timmy found an empty corner of the hideout and sat down on a worn-out couch. His thoughts raced, bouncing between the events of the night and the weight of the choices that were piling up before him. He had started this journey with one goal: to protect his family, to survive. But now, survival was becoming something far more complex. It wasn't just about escaping danger anymore. It was about becoming part of a world that didn't care about morals, about loyalty, or about doing the right thing. The bikers weren't just criminals. They were a family, twisted and broken, bound together by a shared code of honor and a willingness to sacrifice everything. Timmy closed his eyes, trying to push away the suffocating thoughts. He knew he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. The only thing that mattered was staying alive and keeping his head low, at least for now. The next morning, the mood in the hideout was different. The bikers were tense, moving quickly, preparing for what Timmy assumed was the retaliation that Tony had mentioned. There was a sense of urgency in the air, and even though no one was saying anything outright, it was clear that things had escalated. Timmy was summoned by Tony in the early afternoon. This time, Tony's demeanor was colder, more calculating. "We've got work to do," Tony said as Timmy entered his office. The air between them was thick with the unspoken tension of the night before. The attack hadn't just been a brush with danger. It had been a warning, one that made it clear that the Sons of Liberty weren't going to back down. Timmy's stomach churned. "What are we doing?" Tony handed him a manila envelope, his eyes sharp as he studied Timmy's reaction. "You're going to help me settle things with the Sons of Liberty. We're going to pay them back for last night. And this time, we're making sure they get the message." Timmy's heart pounded in his chest. He had expected some kind of retaliation, But the coldness in Tony's voice made it clear that this wasn't just about reclaiming territory. It was about sending a message that couldn't be ignored. This was going to be dangerous, and the risks were higher than ever before. Tony pointed to the envelope. Inside, you'll find the details. We're hitting one of their supply routes. It's risky, but if we pull this off, it'll hurt them where it counts. But remember, no mistakes. They're not just another gang. They'll do whatever it takes to get us. Timmy nodded, trying to steady his breath. The weight of the situation settled deeper into his bones. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of this, a cog in the machine, one that was now moving toward a conflict that could very well end in bloodshed. As he left Tony's office, his mind raced. He had already made a choice. He was in this world now, for better or worse. But as he looked down at the envelope, the reality of it all hit him with full force. There was no going back. Later that evening, the bikers gathered in a secluded spot near the city's outskirts. The plan was in motion. Timmy, Tony, and a handful of others were gearing up for the heist. Timmy's palms were sweaty as he strapped on his gloves, his mind replaying everything that could go wrong. They had been ambushed before, and there was nothing stopping the Sons of Liberty from retaliating. The stakes were higher now, and everyone knew it. Ready? Tony's voice cut through the tension, and Timmy looked up to find him standing by his bike, a grim expression on his face. Timmy nodded, trying to find the courage in his chest. Yeah. They mounted their bikes and rode off into the night, the city lights fading behind them as they made their way to the supply route. The further they went, the more Timmy's anxiety grew. The risk of being caught, of being shot, of losing everything, weighed on him. But the truth was, he was already in too deep. There was no turning back now. The night was cold, and the city seemed eerily quiet as the bikers sped down the highway, their engines growling beneath them. Timmy's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment that would either solidify his place in the gang or break him entirely. Tony was leading the charge, and Timmy, despite the storm raging in his chest, followed closely behind, the roar of his bike a constant reminder of the stakes. The plan was simple enough. Hit the Sons of Liberty's supply route hard and fast, steal what they could, and leave no trace. But Timmy knew better than anyone that nothing ever went according to plan in the world they inhabited. There was too much at risk, too many people willing to die for a point, and too many eyes watching. As they neared the supply route, Tony slowed his bike, signaling the others to follow suit. They pulled off the main road and onto a hidden dirt path, where a small convoy of trucks awaited, trucks filled with stolen goods. It was a quiet operation, until it wasn't. The sound of the engines had already alerted the guards stationed at the supply depot, and before Timmy could process what was happening, gunfire rang out from the trees. "Get down!" Tony yelled, swerving his bike to avoid the incoming shots. Timmy's instincts kicked in. He hit the ground, rolling behind a pile of crates, his breath ragged as his heart raced. He had barely registered the sounds of the others firing back when a sharp pain ripped through his side. He gritted his teeth, fighting back a scream, as his hand instinctively went to the wound. Blood was seeping through his shirt, but there was no time to deal with it. "Stay low," Tony shouted from the front, his voice fierce as he fired off a few more rounds at the enemies in the trees. "We need to move fast." Timmy could hear the sounds of chaos around him, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of the bikers, and the thundering of truck tires. His head spun, the pain in his side threatening to overtake him, but he knew better than to panic. Panic would get him killed. He forced himself to his feet, staggering slightly as he moved toward Tony's position. The rest of the bikers were engaged in firefights with the Sons of Liberty's men, trying to push them back while they secured the trucks. Timmy's vision blurred, but he kept moving. As he made his way forward, he saw Tony in the distance, engaging with one of the guards. Without thinking, Timmy pulled his gun from its holster, aiming carefully at the enemy and firing. The shot hit its mark, and the guard dropped, giving Tony the opening he needed to charge forward. Tony gave him a brief, approving nod before turning back to the task at hand. But Timmy wasn't sure if that nod was enough to make him feel better, or worse. The reality of the situation was sinking in. This wasn't a game. This wasn't just about loyalty or proving himself to Tony. This was life or death. The firefight raged on, but the bikers were making progress. One by one, they neutralized the guards and moved toward the trucks. Timmy, despite the pain in his side, kept up, following Tony's lead. He had no choice. His life, his future, depended on this moment. But then, just as the last of the Sons of Liberty's guards were retreating into the woods, a figure emerged from the shadows. Timmy's breath caught in his throat. It was the leader of the Sons of Liberty, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his left cheek. He was holding a shotgun, his eyes narrowed and filled with hatred as he surveyed the bikers. The moment their eyes locked, Timmy knew it wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was personal. Tony's voice came through the chaos, calm but filled with a deadly edge. That's him. That's the bastard who's been making our lives hell. Timmy felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the final confrontation. Without waiting for Tony's order, Timmy moved forward, his body moving on instinct, the pain in his side pushed aside by the need to act. He dove into cover behind a stack of crates as the Sons of Liberty leader raised his shotgun, aiming at Tony. Timmy's finger tightened on the trigger of his own weapon, and in that split second, he fired. The bullet hit the leader square in the chest, sending him stumbling back. But he wasn't finished. The leader dropped the shotgun and pulled a knife from his belt, his face twisted with rage. He charged at Tony, and the two locked in a vicious struggle. Timmy was too far to help directly, but he knew the moment was crucial. The bikers had to win this fight, not just for survival, but to send a message to anyone who thought they could mess with them. The fight was intense. Tony was a skilled fighter, but the leader of the Sons of Liberty was no slouch. They traded blows, each one landing with brutal force, until Tony finally managed to knock the leader to the ground, pinning him down. "You're done," Tony growled, his voice low and filled with venom. The leader, bloodied and beaten, glared up at him. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice hoarse. "We'll be back. You can't run this town forever." Tony's expression hardened. "We'll see about that." With one final, brutal motion, Tony finished the fight. The leader of the Sons of Liberty was no longer a threat. The remaining Sons of Liberty members scattered, their morale shattered. The bikers had won the fight, but the victory felt hollow in Timmy's chest. The adrenaline began to fade, and he realized just how much the fight had taken out of him. The pain in his side had intensified, and he staggered slightly as he made his way back to Tony. "You good?" Tony asked, his voice surprisingly gentle as he looked at Timmy's wound. Timmy nodded, but the pain was almost unbearable now. "I'll live," he muttered, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Tony gave him a brief, approving glance. "Good. You did well tonight. Real well. You've earned your place with us." Timmy's heart raced at the words. He had done it. He had survived, proved himself, and in some ways, come into his own. But even as he felt a sense of accomplishment, he couldn't shake the weight of what it all meant. The world he had stepped into was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. As the bikers gathered their spoils and started to make their way back, Timmy realized that his life had changed forever. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more danger, more violence, and more hard choices. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might be ready for whatever came next.